The men who tied that sack didn't bother to check if she was still breathing. They'd beaten her for nearly an hour, 2 of them taking turns while a third held a lantern and watched with the flat, patient expression of a man waiting for rain to stop. When she finally stopped moving, stopped making any sound at all, they dragged her through the dark to the dry creek bed north of town, stuffed her into a burlap sack they'd brought along for exactly this purpose, and knotted the rope so tight the rough fibers cut into the fabric where her wrists pressed against it from inside. One of them kicked the bundle once to see if it shifted. It did. Faintly. He kicked it again. Then they walked back to their horses and rode south without looking back. They left her there to die slowly, alone, in the Wyoming dark, because she had found something she was never supposed to find, and they were almost certain no one would ever know. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly who I made it for. Subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss what comes next, because the stories we tell here don't let go easily. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that cottonwood tree, because something was still moving inside that sack when the sun came up. The morning Gideon Vance found her, he almost didn't stop. He'd ridden the northern boundary of Silver Hollow Ranch since before sunrise, the same loop he did 3 or 4 times a week when sleep stopped coming and lying in the dark felt worse than moving through it. The horse knew the route well enough that Gideon barely had to think about steering. He rode with his coat pulled close and his hat low and his mind mostly nowhere, which was the way he preferred it these days. Lottie had insisted on coming. She did that sometimes, woke before dawn and appeared at his bedroom door already dressed, boots on the wrong feet half the time, hair uncombed, holding her own small hat like a question. He never had the heart to send her back to bed. She was 5 years old and she'd already lost her mother. The least he could give her was mornings. She rode in front of him on the saddle, her back against his chest, both small hands wrapped around the horn. She'd been quiet for most of the ride, which wasn't unusual. Lottie had long stretches of quiet that her mother used to call thinking spells. Gideon had learned not to interrupt them. They were coming around the bend near the old cottonwood, a big leaning tree with bark the color of ash that had been dying slowly for years, when Lottie sat up straighter. "Papa." Something's moving over there." Gideon looked. The tree stood maybe 40 feet off the trail, at the edge of the dry creek bed that ran along the northern pasture line. The morning light was still thin and gray, and for a moment he saw nothing unusual, just the tree. The pale, cracked dirt of the creek bed, the long grass on either side. Then he saw the shape. It was low to the ground and lumped and wrong, the kind of shape that didn't belong in a landscape. Dark fabric, or burlap maybe, rounded on one side where something pressed against it from within. "Stay here," he said. "But Papa, Lottie, stay." He swung down from the saddle and ground-tied the horse and walked toward it, one hand going to the rifle in its scabbard out of reflex before he stopped himself. Whatever was inside that sack wasn't moving much, just a faint, shallow shift like breathing. He crouched beside it. The rope was thick and knotted hard, and there was blood on the burlap, dried brown in some places, still darkly wet in others. His stomach clenched. He pulled his knife and cut the rope in 2 places and pulled the burlap back. She was curled on her side, wrists bound together in front of her with a shorter piece of rope. Her face was wrong, swollen on the left side so badly her eye had disappeared into the puffed flesh, a cut across her cheekbone dried and crusted, her lips split in the corner. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. Her feet were bare and both had cuts on them, like she'd been running somewhere before they'd caught her. She was breathing, shallow and uneven, but breathing. Gideon stared at her for a moment with a feeling he couldn't name. Not quite shock, something colder than that, and angrier. He heard small footsteps behind him. "Lottie, I told you." But Lottie had already come around him and stopped. She looked at the woman on the ground with the absolute, unfiltered attention of a young child who hasn't yet learned to look away from things that are hard to see. Her brow furrowed. She crouched down, the way her father had, and reached out and took the woman's bound hands in both of hers. The woman's fingers twitched. Lottie looked up at Gideon with an expression he couldn't read. "Papa?" she said quietly. "She belongs with us." Gideon stood there with the knife still in his hand and the morning getting lighter around them, and no good answer for that. He cut the rope from her wrists. Getting her back to the house was not simple. The woman was conscious in fragments. She'd open her eyes and then close them again. And when Gideon lifted her, she made a sound that carved something out of him. He managed it with Lottie walking alongside holding the horse's lead rope with both hands, very serious about the job, talking to the horse in a low, steady murmur that Gideon suspected was mostly for herself. He laid the woman in the spare room, the one that had been his wife Clara's sewing room before it became just a room with a closed door, and sent Lottie to heat water and find the medicine box while he got a look at the injuries in actual light. It was bad. Not as bad as it had first seemed, because head wounds and face wounds bled dramatically and looked worse than they often were. But bad enough. 2 ribs felt wrong when he pressed along her side gently, and she gasped and her hands came up even in her half-unconscious state, pushing him away. He stepped back and waited. "Easy," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe." She opened the eye that wasn't swollen shut, dark brown, bloodshot at the edges. She stared at him for a long moment with an expression he recognized. The animal wariness of someone who has very recently learned that hands reaching toward her mean pain. "You're at Silver Hollow Ranch," he said. "My name is Gideon Vance. I found you in a sack in the creek bed north of here." He paused. "Someone tied you up and left you there." Her mouth moved. "What's your name?" he asked. She opened her mouth again and then stopped. Something shifted in her face. Not quite pain, confusion, a kind of frightened blankness. "I don't..." Her voice came out cracked and almost inaudible. "I don't know." Gideon looked at her for a moment. "Okay," he said. "That's okay. It'll come back." He wasn't sure that was true, but she needed to hear something steady, and it was what he had. Lottie appeared in the doorway with a bowl of water and a rag and the medicine box tucked under her arm, balanced with the careful determination of someone who has decided this is the most important task she will ever perform. "I found the medicine box," she announced, "and I didn't spill the water very much." "Good girl. What's her name?" Gideon looked at the woman on the bed, who had closed her eye again and was breathing steadily now, just barely. "She doesn't remember right now," he said. Lottie considered this with great seriousness. "Then we should give her one, so she has something to answer to." Gideon almost said something practical. Instead he said, "What do you think?" Lottie set the bowl down on the chair beside the bed with enormous care. "Maeve," she said. "She looks like a Maeve." He had no idea where his 5-year-old had come across the name Maeve. He also had no idea what a Maeve looked like. But the woman on the bed, as if she'd heard, though he was nearly certain she was unconscious, let out a long, slow breath. "Maeve it is," Gideon said. She slept for almost 2 days. Gideon sent his hired hand, a quiet man named Doss who'd worked Silver Hollow for 6 years and asked few questions, into town for the doctor. Doc Alderman came out, looked her over, confirmed the ribs and the concussion and a half-dozen other injuries in the measured, clinical way of a man who'd seen too much to show surprise easily. He told Gideon to keep her still and keep the wounds clean and let her sleep. "She's been beaten by someone who intended for her not to get up again," Alderman said quietly in the hallway, out of Lottie's range. "You understand what I'm saying?" "I understand. You don't know who she is." "She doesn't know who she is?" Alderman looked at him steadily. "You plan to report this to Sheriff Mercer?" "When she's able to talk. There's nothing to report yet except that someone tried to kill a woman and failed." Gideon held the doctor's gaze. "I'd like to know the full story before I hand it to anyone." Alderman picked up his bag. "That's your business, not mine. I'll check back in 3 days. Keep the face wound from going septic." At the door he paused. "The little girl hasn't left that room much." "I know." "She your wife's? Or..." "She's mine," Gideon said, with a flatness that ended the question. Lottie's attachment to Maeve was immediate and total in the way that only small children can manage, the kind of certainty that hasn't yet learned to hedge itself with doubt or caution. She brought Maeve things. A cup of water placed with enormous care on the chair beside the bed. A smooth river stone from her collection, set on the windowsill where Maeve could see it when she opened her eyes. A book she couldn't read herself but held up anyway when Maeve was awake enough to look, pointing at the pictures. Gideon watched this from the doorway more than once and felt something he didn't examine closely. On the second evening, Maeve was awake long enough to eat half a bowl of broth and to respond to questions in more than one-word fragments. Her voice was still rough and her thoughts came slowly, but she answered what she could. Her name still wasn't there. She remembered sensations: cold water, the smell of smoke, a room with a low ceiling, and papers spread across a table. She remembered fear, a specific, spiked fear that she said felt like it had been living in her chest for a long time, not something new. She remembered running. She did not remember where from, or why, or toward what. "The men who did this to you," Gideon said. Do you remember them? Her face tightened. Shapes, she said. Voices. One of them called the other. She stopped and pressed her hand against her forehead, as if she could push the memory loose. I can't get it. It'll come. You keep saying that. Because it's probably true. She looked at him. The swelling in her face had gone down enough that she had both eyes now, and with both eyes she had a directness to her gaze that he found a little unsettling in a way he couldn't account for. Not threatening, just present. Like she was actually looking at him, not at a version of him she'd decided on in advance. Why am I still here? She said. You don't know me. No. I could be anybody. You could, he agreed. I could be a criminal, a thief. I could have done something terrible. You could have, he said, but someone tried to kill you for something. In my experience, people don't go to that much trouble over nothing. Whatever you found out or whatever you did, it cost you enough that whoever did this thought you had to die for it. He paused. That doesn't read like a criminal to me. It reads like a witness. She was quiet for a long time. You're taking a risk, she finally said. Lottie's already decided the matter, he said. I'm just making peace with it. That surprised something out of her. Not quite a smile, because her lip was still split and smiling hurt, but something around her eyes that was in the neighborhood of one. Gideon went back to the kitchen. The trouble started on the 4th day. Doss came back from his supply run into Millhaven, the nearest town, 9 miles south along the main road, with a face that told Gideon something before the man even opened his mouth. Talk's going around, Doss said, accepting the coffee Gideon handed him and staring into it. About the woman you brought in. How does anyone know about that? Doc Alderman didn't tell anyone, but his wife might have mentioned something to the woman at the dry goods, or maybe someone saw me riding out with him. I don't know, but people know you found a woman beaten half to death and brought her home. He paused. And they're already decided what kind of woman that makes her. Gideon said nothing. The Bennett brothers were in the saloon saying she was probably someone's runaway wife. The Fletcher woman, the one who runs the boarding house, said she heard it was a fugitive from over in Laramie County, a thief who stole from a family she was working for. Doss turned his cup in his hands. People don't need to know something to have an opinion on it, is all I'm saying. They never did, Gideon said. You plan to bring her into town? When she's able to stand up without her vision going sideways. Doss nodded slowly. There's something else. Stranger rode into Millhaven yesterday, the day before you found her, asking around about a woman who might have come through the area, described her as dangerous, said she was wanted for theft and arson. He set his cup down. He was carrying papers, official-looking ones. Gideon felt the back of his neck go cold. What did he look like? Tall, thin, dark coat, dark hat, kept his voice real level, like a man who's used to people doing what he says. Doss looked up, gave his name as Crow. Saeed, he was a territorial investigator. The name landed in the kitchen like something heavy dropped on the floor. Gideon stood very still. He asked about Silver Hollow specifically? Not by name. Just asked if anyone knew of a woman who might have been sheltered somewhere along the northern road. Doss paused. Nobody told him anything, far as I could tell, but he's still in town. Gideon walked to the window and looked out at the yard and the barn and the fence line and the road beyond it, empty and pale in the mid-morning light. Keep that to yourself, he said, and keep Lottie close to the house. He told Maeve that evening. He kept it simple. A man named Crow had come asking about a woman matching her description, calling her dangerous, claiming she was wanted. He watched her face while he talked, and he saw something happen there. Not recognition, exactly. Something more physical than that. A reaction that moved through her whole body before her mind caught up with it. Her hands gripped the edge of the blanket. Her jaw tightened. The color in her face shifted in a way that had nothing to do with her injuries. Crow, she said. Just the name, flat and quiet. You know him. It wasn't a question. She'd already told him the name meant something. She pressed her hand to her mouth and sat with her eyes closed and her brow furrowed like someone trying to lift something too heavy. I know the name. I can feel it. It's attached to something terrible, but I can't. Her breath came out sharp. I can't get through to it. It's like trying to see through smoke. Smoke, Gideon said carefully. What? You mentioned smoke before, when I asked what you remembered. She opened her eyes. Something moved behind them. Not quite a memory, but the edge of one. The way you can sometimes see the shape of a fish moving just below the surface of dark water without being able to make out what kind it is. There was a fire, she said slowly. I remember children. I remember children and smoke and doors that wouldn't. She stopped. Her hands were shaking. Someone locked the doors. Easy, Gideon said. Someone locked them in, she said. The shake in her voice was controlled but present. Children. There were children and someone locked the doors and I was trying to... She stopped again and pressed both hands flat on the blanket and seemed to deliberately slow her breathing. I don't know. I can't see the rest of it. You don't have to tonight. The man named Crow. She looked at Gideon. I'm afraid of that name, not afraid of what it does to me, afraid of what it means that he's still looking. He hasn't found you. Yet. The word sat between them in the lamplight. He will, she said. That kind of man doesn't stop looking. Gideon pulled the chair closer and sat. Then let's make sure you remember everything you need to before he gets here, he said. Because if you're right about what that name means to you, whatever you know is the only thing that protects you. She looked at him for a long moment. Why are you doing this, she said. And don't say Lottie, I want your answer. He considered that honestly. Because I opened that sack, he said. And some things you can't close back up after. She didn't say anything to that, but her hands stopped shaking. 6 days after Gideon brought her home, Maeve was on her feet, unevenly and with one hand on the wall when the dizzy spells came, but on her feet. She insisted on it. Gideon had watched enough injured things try to stay still and fail. Horses, dogs, once a calf that had gotten tangled in wire, to know that the ones who fought to move were usually the ones who survived. He cleared a path between the bedroom and the kitchen and said nothing about the way she pressed her hand against the doorframe each morning before committing to the hallway. Lottie appointed herself guide. She walked beside Maeve at a careful distance, not touching unless Maeve reached for the wall and narrated the house the way a small person might narrate something very important. That's where Papa hangs his coat. That hook's the one he uses even though the other hooks are right there. Mama used to say it was because he was stubborn, but she said it nice. A pause. That's the kitchen. That's the window I like because you can see the barn from it if you lean right, she demonstrated. That's the stool where I sit when Papa lets me help with breakfast. He lets me stir things. You're a good stirrer? Maeve asked. Her voice was still low and rough, but it was getting stronger. Very good, Lottie said seriously. Doss says I'm the best stirrer on the whole ranch. High praise from a man who knows ranches. Lottie beamed. Gideon watched from the other side of the kitchen and told himself he wasn't watching. By the 8th day, Maeve was working. Not heavy work. She couldn't lift or pull without the ribs reminding her sharply that they were still wrong, but she found things she could do without being asked. She gathered the eggs each morning, moving slowly across the yard with Lottie behind her. She sat at the kitchen table and mended things, her needle moving through fabric with a steadiness that told Gideon her hands had done this kind of work before, many times and over many years. When Doss brought back a half-torn harness strap from the barn with a helpless expression, Maeve looked it over, asked for an awl and the right weight of thread, and fixed it in under an hour. Doss stood in the kitchen doorway staring at the repaired strap with genuine amazement. Where'd you learn to do that? I don't know, Maeve said, and then, quietly, almost to herself, but my hands knew. The days fell into a rhythm. Gideon didn't name it. Naming things made them permanent, and permanent things could be taken away, and he'd had enough of that. But the house felt different than it had in the 3 years since Clara died. Less like a place someone was maintaining and more like a place someone was living in. He kept his eye on the south road. On the 10th day, a rider came. Not Crow, one of the Bennett brothers, Ray Bennett, heavy-set and ruddy-faced, who had the particular quality of someone who has decided his opinion is a service to others. He tied his horse at the gate and came up to the porch where Gideon was replacing a broken board, and he stood there with his hat in his hands in the way of a man who wants to seem polite while saying something impolite. Gideon, he said, heard you took in a stray. Gideon kept working. You heard wrong. There's a woman here that nobody knows. People are usually saying something, Gideon said, doesn't make it worth listening to. Ray shifted his weight. Look, nobody's saying you meant anything by it. A man finds someone hurt, he helps. That's just decent. But you don't know who she is. She's a woman who nearly got beaten to death, Gideon said. He set down his hammer and looked at Ray directly. That's what I know. Everything else is your neighbors filling in details they don't have. Ray's face went a shade redder. There's a man in town saying she's dangerous. Official man, papers and all. Has this official man come to me with his papers? A pause. Not yet. Then there's nothing to discuss. Gideon picked the hammer back up. I'll thank you to close the gate on your way out. Ray Bennett stood there another moment, clearly feeling that the conversation had not gone the way he'd arranged it in his head on the ride over. Then he put his hat back on and went. Maeve was standing just inside the front door. She'd heard all of it. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. It's going to make things harder for you. Probably, he agreed. She looked at him for a moment. You're a very strange man, Gideon Vance. My wife used to say the same thing, he said, and went back to fixing the board. There was a short silence. She sounds like she was smart, Maeve said. She was, he said, smarter than me, most of the time. Maeve went back inside. He could hear Lottie immediately beginning to tell her something about the barn cat and a recent injustice involving the other cats, her voice carrying the passionate detail of someone who has been waiting to report this information and is finally getting the chance. Gideon kept working. The board went in straight. On the 12th day, Silas Crow came to Silver Hollow. He came in the middle of the afternoon, alone, which Gideon noted because a man with a mob at his back usually brought the mob. Crow without a mob was a man who thought he didn't need one. That was in some ways worse. He was as Doss had described him, tall, angular, in the way of someone who'd once been heavier and lost the weight in circumstances that hadn't been pleasant. He wore a dark coat despite the warmth of the day, and he had papers folded in his breast pocket that he touched once, just briefly, when he dismounted, as if checking they were still there. His face was long and composed. The composure was the kind you built carefully over time, not the kind you were born with. Gideon met him at the gate. Mr. Vance, Crow said. My name is Silas Crow. I'm a territorial investigator working out of Laramie. I believe you may have information regarding a fugitive I'm tracking. That's a lot of words for, I've heard you have a woman here, Gideon said. Something moved briefly across Crow's composed face. Not quite irritation. Something more controlled. You have a woman on your property whose identity is unclear. I have a woman on my property who was beaten half to death and left in a sack in my creek bed, Gideon said. Her identity being unclear is the result of whoever did that to her. She may have told you otherwise. She hasn't told me much of anything. Memory loss from head injuries is a medical condition, not a story. Crow's eyes moved to the house. Gideon moved slightly, not dramatically, just enough to be between Crow and the door. Mr. Vance, Crow said with deliberate patience, the woman you're sheltering may be a dangerous criminal. Her real name is Maeve Rourke. She was employed at the Blackthorn Children's Home near Crestfield until approximately 3 weeks ago, when a fire destroyed the building and killed 2 staff members. Miss Rourke disappeared the same night. Evidence suggests she set the fire. The name Maeve Rourke landed in the air between them. Gideon kept his face neutral. She also stole records from the home before the fire, Crow continued. Valuable records. If she has recovered enough to speak, I need to speak with her, and I have the authority to compel her cooperation. He produced the papers from his breast pocket and held them out. Gideon took them, read them, took his time about it. They were official-looking, stamps, signatures, the right language. He was not a lawyer and couldn't verify them, but they had been put together by someone who knew what official papers were supposed to look like. He handed them back. She's not well enough for questioning, he said. Doctor's orders. Dr. Alderman has confirmed. Doc Alderman sees her every 3 days. He was here yesterday. He said she needs rest. He met Crow's eyes. Come back in a week. Mr. Vance, a week, Gideon said. In the meantime, if you want to file a report with Sheriff Mercer that a woman was found beaten and left for dead on my property, I'll ride in with you right now and do exactly that. We can discuss your charges at the same time. Crow looked at him for a long moment with those composed, careful eyes. You're making a mistake, he said. Sheltering a fugitive puts you in a difficult position legally. I'm sheltering an injured woman at a doctor's instruction, Gideon said. The law I know of doesn't have a problem with that. Another long pause. 1 week, Crow said finally. He put the papers back in his pocket, touching them once again as he did. I'll be back. He mounted his horse and rode south. Gideon stood at the gate until the dust settled. Then he went inside. Maeve was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface and her eyes open and something entirely different in her face than had been there before. Lottie was in the yard, just the 2 of them. You heard, he said. All of it. Maeve Rourke, he said. Does that... Yes. Her voice was very quiet. That's my name. I can feel it settling in like something clicking into place. She pressed her hands harder against the table. And the fire. He said fire and children's home. And she stopped. The memories were coming. He could see it happening. Not smoothly, not the way it went in stories where everything returned in a single wave of clarity. This was jagged. This was her face going through a dozen expressions in the space of 10 seconds. Her hands gripping the table edge, her breathing going short and then deliberate and then short again. Blackthorn, she said. The Blackthorn Children's Home. Her eyes were focused on something he couldn't see. I worked there. I was there for nearly 2 years. I managed the records, the intake forms, the placement records, the correspondence with the county. A pause. And then I found the other records. What other records? Her eyes came to his, brown and very steady now, despite everything. The ones that showed where the children were really going, she said. Not to families, not to honest work placements. She swallowed. They were being sold. To ranches, to businesses, to wealthy men who wanted labor they didn't have to pay and couldn't complain. Her jaw tightened. Children, some of them no older than Lottie. The kitchen was very quiet. I took the ledgers, she said. All the records I could carry. I hid them before... She stopped. Before the fire. Crow's men started the fire. I watched them do it. Her voice was steady in the way of someone who has decided that falling apart is not something she has time for. 2 people died because they were still inside. Crow burned it to destroy the evidence. She looked at Gideon. Except I already had the evidence, and he knew it, and he's been looking for me since. Gideon sat down across from her. The ledgers, he said carefully. Where are they? She met his eyes. I know exactly where they are, she said. I buried them before they caught me. They think they're gone. They're not gone. Outside, he heard Lottie in the yard talking to the barn cat, explaining something at length and with great seriousness. He'll be back in a week, Gideon said. Probably sooner. I know. When he comes back, it won't be alone. I know that too. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Then we need to figure out what we're doing before he gets here, he said. Maeve Rourke, whose name had come back to her inside a kitchen on a ranch in Wyoming while a man who wanted her dead was riding south to plan his next move, straightened in her chair. I already know what we're doing, she said. Her hands had stopped shaking. She already knew what they were doing, and that was the problem, because what Maeve wanted to do was the most dangerous thing available to either of them, and Gideon spent the better part of that evening trying to find a reason she was wrong about it. He couldn't. She wanted to go to Sheriff Mercer before Crow came back. Not hide, not run, not wait for Crow to build his case in town, while she sat at Silver Hollow hoping no one came with a rope and a righteous expression. She wanted to walk into Millhaven and tell Caleb Mercer everything, the ledgers, the children, the fire, Crow's involvement, before Crow had the chance to shape the story for him. If Crow gets to Mercer first with his version, she said, then when I come in later with mine, I'm already the liar. I'm already the fugitive making up stories to avoid arrest. She said it without heat, just laying it out the way you'd lay out a hand of cards. He's had weeks to work on the story. I've had an hour to remember it. I need to move before he does. You can barely walk a straight line without gripping something, Gideon said. I can ride. Maeve, I can ride, she said again. And I've had a day to remember who I am and what I know, and sitting here another week while Crow builds a mob is not a plan. It's just waiting to be buried. She looked at him steadily. I know how this goes, Gideon. I've watched it go this way before. The people with papers and authority and a story already told always beat the people who wait to tell theirs. He was quiet for a while. You'd be walking into town with no evidence, he said. The ledgers are buried at Blackthorn. You've got nothing but your word. My word and your name, she said. And your name is worth something in this county. I don't have one that means anything yet, but I have yours. He wasn't sure what to do with that. Exactly. The frank calculation of it, the way she said it not as slattery, but as plain fact. He pulled at the edge of his coffee cup and thought about Crow's eyes at the gate that afternoon. The composure, the patience, the touching of the papers as if they were weapons he was checking. In the morning, he said finally, we ride in the morning, and you don't go anywhere near Mercer without me next to you. She nodded once. No argument. No gratitude either, which he appreciated. You should sleep, he said. I know. She didn't move. Tell me about Mercer. What kind of man is he? Gideon considered it honestly. Careful, he said. Not ambitious, which is actually useful here. He's not looking to make a reputation, so he's less likely to side with whoever makes him look more important. He follows evidence when he has it, and he follows the town when he doesn't, which is the problem. Right now, the town is following Crow. Has he ever gotten it wrong? Follow the town when the town was wrong? A pause. Once, Gideon said, he'd want me to tell you he's different now. Is he? I don't know. I hope so. He set his cup down. Get some sleep, Maeve. Tomorrow's going to be a long day, regardless of how it goes. She stood up from the table, steadier than she'd been 3 days ago, and paused in the kitchen doorway. Your wife, she said. Did she know Mercer? Gideon looked up. Clara? Yes, they grew up here. Did she trust him? He thought about it carefully. She trusted his intentions, he said. She wasn't always certain about his nerve. Maeve nodded slowly, as if she were filing that away. Good night, Gideon. Good night. He sat in the kitchen for another hour after she went to her room, listening to the ranch settle around him in the dark, and he thought about nerve and whether Caleb Mercer had grown into it or out of it in the 3 years since Clara's funeral. He told Lottie in the morning that he and Maeve were going to town and that she would stay with Doss. Lottie received this information with the expression of someone who has been deeply wronged but is choosing to handle it with maturity. Is Maeve coming back? She said. We're going to town and coming back, Gideon said. That's all. But is she coming back? He crouched down to her level. Yes, he said. She is. Lottie looked at him for a moment with Clara's eyes, that particular shade of gray-brown that could see through things. And then she turned to Maeve, who was pulling on her coat by the door. You'll come back, Lottie said. Not a question. Maeve buttoned the top button of her coat and looked at Lottie with an expression Gideon didn't have a name for. I'll come back, she said quietly. Promise? A pause, brief but real. Yes, Maeve said. I promise. Lottie seemed to accept this. She went to stand with Doss by the barn, her arms crossed and her small face set in the expression of someone keeping watch, which she probably was. They rode south. Millhaven in the early morning had that specific quality of small towns not yet fully awake. Horses at the hitching post outside the saloon left over from the night before, the smell of wood smoke from the bakery, a dog sleeping in the middle of the main street with no intention of moving. The general store wasn't open yet. The livery was. Gideon had been watching the road the whole way in. No sign of Crow or anyone riding hard towards Silver Hollow from the other direction. Either Crow was staying at the hotel and hadn't started his day, or he was already somewhere they couldn't see. Mercer's office was on the east end of the main street, a low building with a covered porch and a hand-painted sign that had been weathered to the point where the lettering was mostly memory at this point. The door was unlocked. Mercer was inside with a cup of coffee and a week-old newspaper and the look of a man who'd already been awake for 2 hours because sleep, for various reasons, had stopped being reliable. He was in his mid-40s, broad through the chest, with a face that had been pleasant once and had aged into something more complicated. He stood when they came in. His eyes moved from Gideon to Maeve and stayed there for a moment, taking in the fading bruising, the slight favor she gave her left side when she moved. Gideon, he said carefully. Caleb, this is Maeve Rourke. She needs to speak with you. Mercer looked at Maeve directly. I've heard your name, he said. Recently. I know you have, Maeve said. That's why I'm here. He gestured to the chairs across from his desk and they sat, and Maeve talked. She talked for nearly 40 minutes. Gideon sat beside her and said nothing, because she didn't need him to. She had organized it in her head overnight. He could tell by the way she moved through it, not hesitating, going in order, the intake records and the placement ledgers, and the moment she realized the children weren't going where the paperwork said they were going. She described the alternative records she'd found hidden in a locked drawer in the administrator's office. She named the administrator, a man called Pritchard, who had been one of the 2 who died in the fire. She described going back for the ledgers, hiding them, running. She described being caught on the road south of Crestfield and what came after. She didn't minimize the beating. She stated it plainly, in the same measured tone she used for everything else, and that plainness was more affecting than any dramatics would have been. Mercer listened without interrupting. His coffee got cold. When she finished, the office was quiet for a moment. These ledgers, Mercer said, you're certain they survived the fire. I buried them before the fire started, at the Blackthorn property, in the courtyard beneath the old cottonwood by the east wall. They're in a metal box. The box is sealed. She paused. I chose metal specifically because I knew fire was a possibility. Mercer looked at her steadily. You knew fire was a possibility before the fire happened. I knew Crow's people had been at the property twice in the week before I found the records. I knew what that meant. I made preparations." She met his eyes. I wasn't fast enough. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Crow came in here yesterday afternoon," he said. "Showed me papers. Made a case that you were a fugitive who'd committed arson and theft and assault on the administrator who died." "Pritchard," Maeve said. "I didn't assault him. He died in the fire that Crow's men set. Crow claims you started the fire. Crow claims whatever protects him." She leaned forward slightly. "Sheriff Mercer, I understand you have his version, and now you have mine and no physical evidence in front of you except my face. I understand that. I'm asking you to ride out to Blackthorn with me and Mr. Vance and retrieve the ledgers before Crow or anyone working for him figures out where I put them. Because the ledgers don't lie. They have names in them. Not just the children, the buyers, the men who paid. Some of them live in this county." Something changed in Mercer's expression at that. Not dramatic, just a small tightening around the eyes. "Some of them," he said slowly. "I haven't seen the ledgers since I buried them," Maeve said, "but I read them before I did. I remember names. If you want, I can write some of them down right now, and you can decide for yourself whether I'm making things up." A long pause. "Write them down," Mercer said. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. Maeve picked up the pencil he offered and wrote for about a minute. She slid it back. Mercer read it. His face didn't change in any way that Gideon could read, which was itself a kind of information. He folded the paper and put it in his desk drawer. "Where's Crow now?" Gideon said. "Hotel, far as I know. How long before he comes back at you pushing for action?" Mercer looked at him. "He already did. This morning, before you got here, came in at 7 with 2 men he said were deputies from Laramie." He paused. "I've sent a wire to Laramie to verify." Maeve said, "He'll intercept the reply if he can. I am aware of that possibility." Mercer stood up and went to the window and stood there for a moment looking at the street. "I'll ride out to Blackthorn," he said. "Not today. I need to arrange neutral witnesses before I dig up anything, or Crow will just claim I planted it." He turned back. "The day after tomorrow, I'll bring the land surveyor and Judge Fowler's clerk, who's about the most neutral human being in this territory." He looked at Maeve. "You come. You show me exactly where it is. You do not go anywhere near Blackthorn between now and then." "Understood. And Miss Rourke." He held her gaze. "If you're wrong about what's in that box, if it's empty, or it's something other than what you've described, I cannot protect you from what comes after. You understand that." "I'm not wrong," she said. He nodded once. "Day after tomorrow. First light." They were back on the road north before mid-morning. Gideon had been watching the street when they came out of Mercer's office, and he'd seen Crow standing on the porch of the hotel across the street, one shoulder against the post, watching. He'd said nothing to Maeve, but Crow had seen them both come out of the sheriff's office, and he had the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic. Maeve had seen him too. "He knows," she said quietly as they rode out of town. "Yes. He'll move faster now. Probably." Gideon kept his eyes on the road ahead, "which is why we needed Mercer to move first, and he will. I know Caleb. Once he started down that road, he doesn't reverse. You believe that?" "I believe he's too careful to let himself be made a fool of, and Crow is exactly the kind of man who makes fools of careful people if they let him." He glanced at her. "Caleb doesn't like being anyone's fool." Maeve was quiet for a stretch of road, the horses moving at a steady walk, the Wyoming hills pale gold in the late morning light. "I keep thinking about the children," she said. It came out low, like something she hadn't intended to say aloud. "The ones in the ledgers. I don't know where they all ended up. Some of them might still be. Still in those placements, wherever they are. The ledgers will have records. If the buyers kept them. If the records survived wherever they went." She exhaled. "Some of those children were placed years ago. They could be anywhere in the territory." "One thing at a time," Gideon said. He said it gently. "First the ledgers, then the rest." She nodded, but her jaw was set in a way that told him she was making a list in her head, and the list was long. They came back to Silver Hollow to find Lottie exactly where she'd promised to be. In the yard with Doss, who was mending a fence section and letting her hand him nails with great seriousness. She dropped the nails the moment she saw them coming up the road and ran to the gate. She stopped just short of Maeve's horse and looked up. "You came back." "I said I would," Maeve said. She dismounted. carefully favoring her left side, and Lottie didn't hug her the way she sometimes flung herself at Gideon. She just stood close, the way she did when something important had happened and she was figuring out what it meant. "Did the sheriff help?" Lottie asked. "He's going to try," Maeve said. Lottie considered this. "Is that good?" "It's better than nothing," Maeve said. "Right now, that's enough." She went inside. Lottie watched her go and then turned to Gideon with her arms crossed. "She was scared," she said, "when she came back." "She doesn't look scared," Gideon said. "She doesn't look it," Lottie agreed, "but she walked different when she got off the horse, like she was holding something heavy that nobody could see." Gideon looked at his daughter for a moment. "You noticed too much," he said. "Mama said that too." Lottie picked up the dropped nails and went back to Doss. She said it like it was a bad thing, but it isn't. He tied the horses and went inside. That night, the trouble that had been circling Silver Hollow like weather finally landed on the porch. Gideon was in the barn doing late feeding when Doss came in fast and quiet and said, "Riders on the South Road, 6 of them. Not Crow, local men. I recognize Fletcher's horse." Fletcher, the boarding house woman's husband, who was also the man who owned the feed mill and sat on the town council and had an outsized sense of his own importance in local affairs. Gideon went to the barn door and looked. 6 riders stopping at the gate. Not aggressive, not yet, but not the body language of men who'd come to have a friendly conversation either. Fletcher was in the front, a big man who sat a horse the way men do when they've decided they're leading something. Gideon walked to the gate. "Evening, Fletcher," he said. "Gideon." Fletcher's voice had the careful friendliness of a man who's been rehearsing. "We want to talk about your situation." "My situation is fine. What can I do for you?" "It's about the woman." Fletcher glanced at the house, then back. "The town is concerned. There's a territorial investigator saying she's dangerous. I've met the man," Gideon said. "I'm not impressed by his papers." "Gideon!" Fletcher's voice dropped into something more pointed. "You've got a little girl in that house. Whatever you think about this woman, you have to consider—" "Don't," Gideon said. The word came out flat and cold and stopped Fletcher mid-sentence. "Don't use Lottie to make your argument. That's not a road you want to go down with me." Fletcher's jaw tightened. One of the men behind him shifted in his saddle. "Nobody's trying to cause trouble," Fletcher said. "We're just saying, if you hand her over to Crow, let him sort out whatever charges." "She hasn't been charged with anything that holds up," Gideon said, "and she's not going anywhere on the say-so of a man whose papers may or may not be legitimate. The sheriff is handling it." He looked at Fletcher steadily. "Go home, Franklin. You're not going to like how this looks in the morning when things are clearer." A long beat. "And if we don't?" said one of the men behind Fletcher, one of the younger ones, someone's son or nephew who'd been talked into thinking this was exciting. Gideon looked at him. "Then you're trespassing," he said simply, "and I've got every right to treat that accordingly." The young man subsided. Fletcher looked at Gideon with an expression somewhere between frustration and something that might have been the beginning of doubt, the first crack in the certainty he'd ridden out here with. "1 week," Fletcher said finally. "If this isn't resolved—" "It will be," Gideon said. "Go home, Franklin." They went. He stood at the gate until the sound of the hooves faded south, then turned around. Maeve was in the doorway again. Behind her, he could see Lottie's face in the window, watching, the way she'd watched every storm that had rolled through Silver Hollow and decided she was going to watch this one too. "That's going to happen again," Maeve said, "and next time there'll be more of them." "I know. I'm the reason—" "The reason is whoever put you in that sack," he said. "Not you." She looked at him for a moment. He could see her working through something, not quite an argument, just something she needed to get settled in herself before she could put it down. "You can't keep doing this indefinitely," she said. "You have the ranch. You have Lottie. If this gets worse before it gets better. Maeve." He came up the porch steps. "It's 2 days. 2 days and Mercer goes to Blackthorn and those ledgers either exist or they don't. And if they exist, the story changes completely. I can hold this together for 2 days." She didn't argue, but she didn't look entirely convinced either. "Sleep," he said. "Both of us." She went in. He sat on the porch for a while in the dark, listening to nothing particular, and after some time he heard Lottie's window open above him and the small sound of her settling her elbows on the sill. "Papa," she said quietly, "are we going to be okay?" He looked up at her silhouette against the lamplight from her room. "Yes," he said. "You sure?" "Working on it," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Maeve said she'd be brave," Lottie said. She told me when you were in the barn, she said she was going to be brave enough for all of us. He didn't have an answer for that. He just sat with it. Go to sleep, Lottie. You too, Papa. She closed the window. The next day came an overcast and uncertain and brought with it 3 things, 2 of which Gideon had expected and 1 he hadn't. The first was Ray Bennett riding back out to Silver Hollow, but alone this time, and looking considerably less righteous than his previous visit. He stopped at the gate and pulled off his hat and said, without preamble, "My wife thinks I'm an idiot. She also said if I didn't come out here and apologize for the other day, she was going to make my life very difficult in specific ways she described in detail." He paused. "She's right. I was going off what other people were saying, and I don't actually know anything about this woman." He glanced toward the house. "Is she all right?" "She will be," Gideon said. "The investigator, Crow, he was at the saloon last night, buying drinks and talking." Ray put his hat back on. "Gideon, some of what he's saying it's working on people. He's good at it. Calm, reasonable, one thing at a time. A couple of the younger men are starting to think they ought to do something." "I know. They came last night." Ray winced. "I heard." He looked down at his saddle horn. "I'm not saying what he wants me to say. I just think you ought to know it's not just Fletcher anymore. It's getting bigger." "Appreciate it, Ray." Ray nodded and rode back south. The second thing was Doss coming in from the north pasture with a fence section that had been cut. Not broken. Cut cleanly, wire ends snipped with tools. Someone had been on the north boundary in the night, and it wasn't a neighbor who'd had an accident. Gideon looked at the cut ends and thought about the dry creek bed where he'd found Maeve, which ran along the north boundary almost directly under the cottonwood tree. Someone had been walking the property. "Looking it over," he told Maeve. She sat with it for a moment. "They're watching for me to run," she said. "If I run, I'm guilty. If I run and they catch me on the road, there's no Mercer, no witnesses, no ledgers. It's just his papers and his version." She shook her head. "I'm not running." "I know," he said, "but they don't know that yet." "Good," she said. "Let them think I might." The third thing was the thing Gideon hadn't expected. It arrived in the form of a wagon coming up the road from the south around midday. Not threatening, just a farm wagon with an older couple on the seat, a man and a woman in their 60s, and a younger woman sitting in the back with her hands in her lap. They stopped at the gate, and the older woman got down with more ease than her age suggested and walked up to where Gideon was repairing the gate hinge. "You're Vance?" she said. "That's right." "My name is Harriet Wills. My husband Clem farms about 5 miles east of you toward Crestfield. The woman with us is my niece, Dara." She looked at him directly with the kind of eyes that have done a great deal of practical problem solving over a long life. "We heard you have Maeve Rourke here." He kept his face even. "Word travels." "It does." "Dara worked at the Blackthorn home. Not for long. About 4 months last winter. She left because something felt wrong and she couldn't identify what." Harriet paused. She heard what Crow is saying Maeve did. Dara wants to talk to Maeve. And then, if Maeve is who she says she is, Dara wants to talk to the sheriff. Gideon looked at the wagon. The young woman in the back, Dara, maybe 22 or 23, was sitting very still with the posture of someone who has made a decision that frightened her and is committed to it anyway. He opened the gate. "Come in," he said. Maeve and Dara talked for 2 hours. Gideon stayed out of it, but Lottie did not. She brought them water without being asked, and then sat herself down near the kitchen doorway and listened with such absolute discretion that both women seemed to forget she was there, which was almost certainly what she'd intended. He could hear fragments through the wall, Dara's voice starting hesitant and then getting steadier. A name he didn't recognize, someone called Mulder who'd been the business manager at Blackthorn, who had apparently told Dara that a ledger she'd accidentally opened was a supply inventory, and she'd believed him at the time because she was new and he was authoritative. And then Maeve's voice saying, low and certain, that wasn't the supply inventory. Dara: "No, I know that now." Long pause. Maeve: "What do you remember about the children? The ones who were placed the fall before you arrived?" Dara, quieter: "They just weren't there. 1 week there were 12 children in the East dormitory, and then the next week there were 4, and when I asked Mulder where the others went, he said they'd been placed with families in the eastern counties." "Happy placements," he said. "Good news." She paused. "But nobody ever came to see them placed. Nobody checked the paperwork with me. They just disappeared overnight." Maeve: Were any of their files in the intake records after? Dara. No. That was the other thing. I went to file the follow-up correspondence for 2 of the children. I had to. It was part of my job. And their files weren't in the cabinet anymore, like they'd never been. Silence. Maeve, I need you to tell all of this to the sheriff, not just the part about me, the part about the children. Dara. That's why I came. When they came out of the kitchen, Dara's face was the face of someone who has laid something very heavy down and isn't sure yet if she should feel lighter or more frightened. Probably both. Harriet Wills looked at Gideon from across the room with the expression of a woman who has been watching human nature long enough to recognize its best and worst impulses on sight. We'll be at Mercer's office first thing tomorrow, Harriet said. Dara will give her statement before your ride to Blackthorn. She paused. You didn't ask us to come. I want you to understand that. We came because what was done at that place was wrong, and whatever Crow is or isn't, those children are real, and they deserve someone to stand up and say so. I know, Gideon said, and I'm grateful. Harriet looked at Maeve. You're braver than you look, she said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was just an observation, offered plainly. I'm not brave, Maeve said. I'm just out of options. Harriet Wills smiled at that, a small and genuine thing. Sometimes they're the same thing, honey, she said. They stayed for supper. Lottie sat next to Dara and asked her approximately 40 questions about what Blackthorn had looked like before the fire, and Dara answered every one with the patient care of someone who is beginning to understand that small children who pay close attention are among the more important things in the world. Afterward, when the wagon had gone south and the ranch was quiet, Gideon found Maeve on the porch. She was sitting on the step, her back against the post, looking at the dark line of the hills. You didn't expect them, he said. No. Does it change anything? She was quiet for a moment. It changes the weight of it, she said. It's not just me anymore. And that's... She stopped. It makes it more real, and more important, and more terrifying. He sat down on the step, not close, just nearby. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she agreed. Above them, the sky had cleared and the stars were out in force, the way they got on Wyoming nights when the air was dry and the clouds had moved on, making the darkness above look vast and a little indifferent. Gideon was not a man who usually found comfort in landscapes, but there was something about the scale of that sky over the hills of Silver Hollow that made the present trouble, though real and serious and close, seem like something that would eventually pass into the same permanence as everything else. He didn't say that. It would have come out wrong. Instead, he said, Lottie wants to know if you'll teach her to mend things. She decided today that it's a skill she needs. Maeve let out a short sound that was almost a laugh. She decided today? Watching you fix Doss's harness strap put something in her head. She came to me very seriously after supper and told me it was an important skill and she would like to learn it. She's not wrong, Maeve said. No. A quiet settled between them that wasn't uncomfortable. An owl called somewhere north of the barn and didn't repeat itself. I'll teach her, Maeve said after a while, when this is done. When, she'd said, not if. Gideon noticed that. He went inside to check on Lottie and found her already asleep, flat on her back with her arms spread wide the way she'd slept since she was an infant, completely committed to it. He pulled her blanket up and stood in the doorway for a moment. Outside, he could hear the faint sound of Maeve still sitting on the porch step, the slight shift of her weight against the wood, and he understood that she would sit there a while longer, not because the night was comfortable, not because she was at peace, but because she was the kind of person who needed to be awake and watching before something important, and tomorrow was as important as anything had been in a very long time. He left her to it. He went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to Silver Hollow breathe around him, and for the first time in a long while he did not lie there thinking about what was missing. He thought about what tomorrow held and what it might unmake, and what, if things went the way they needed to go, it might build in its place. Sleep came slowly, but it came. Mercer was already at his office when they arrived the next morning, which told Gideon something. A man who didn't believe what he was doing didn't get there before anyone else. Dara Wills was there too, sitting in the chair across from Mercer's desk with Harriet beside her and Clem Wills standing near the wall with his hat in both hands and the quiet, solid presence of a man who has come to back up his family and intends to do exactly that and nothing more. Dara had already given her statement. Mercer had a page of notes in front of him and he was reading back through them when Gideon and Maeve came in. He looked up. Miss Rourke. "Sheriff, Dara's account lines up with what you told me yesterday," he said. He said it without emphasis, just as information, specifically the timing of the placements and the missing files. He set the notes down. "I've also heard back from Laramie this morning." "Ready?" Gideon said. "I sent the wire 2 days ago when Crow first came in, before you came to see me." Mercer's expression didn't change much, but there was something in it, a slight satisfaction maybe at having done the thing before being asked to do it. "The Territorial Investigator's Office in Laramie has a man named Crow on record. He worked there. Past tense. He resigned 14 months ago under circumstances they described as a mutual agreement, which in my experience means someone did something that couldn't quite be proved." The room went quiet. Maeve said, "So his papers are forged, or at least unauthorized." Mercer folded his hands on the desk. "He has no current authority to compel anyone to do anything. He's a private citizen carrying official-looking documents and using a title he no longer holds." He paused. "Which is its own crime, separate from everything else." Gideon looked at Maeve. Her face was very still. "He knew," she said quietly. Not to Mercer, more to herself, working it out. "He knew you'd wire Laramie eventually. He wasn't trying to make a legal case. He was trying to move fast enough that it didn't matter. He just needed to get me in his custody before anyone checked." "That's how I read it," Mercer said. "Where is he now?" Gideon asked. "Hotel as of last night. I've got Ned keeping an eye." Ned was Mercer's deputy, a young man of moderate competence and genuine conscientiousness who took his job seriously in the way that young men do when they haven't yet been disappointed by it. "I haven't moved on Crow yet because I want the ledgers first. With the ledgers, I have everything. Without them, I have a forged credential charge which is real, but which his lawyers could drag out for months while the bigger picture disappears." He stood up. "We ride in an hour. I've got Judge Fowler's clerk, man named Aldous, completely reliable, and the land surveyor, and I'm bringing Ned." He looked at Maeve. "You ride in the middle. I don't want you exposed on the road." "You think Crow will try something before we get there?" Gideon said. "I think Crow is a man who's been watching his entire operation unravel for 2 weeks, and he knows this morning is the moment it either gets saved or finishes collapsing." Mercer picked up his hat. "So, yes, I think he might try something." They left Millhaven 9 strong. Mercer, Ned, Aldous the clerk, the surveyor whose name was Beaumont, Gideon, Maeve, and the 3 Wilses, because Harriet had looked at Mercer when he suggested they stay behind, and he had apparently decided correctly that this was not an argument worth having. The road to Crestfield ran southeast, and it was 2 hours on good ground, longer if the creek crossings were running high from last week's rain. The morning was gray and cool with a wind off the hills that smelled like rain coming again. Maeve rode without speaking for the first hour. Gideon rode beside her and didn't push conversation. He watched the road ahead and the road behind and the tree lines on either side, and he noticed that Mercer was doing the same, moving his eyes in a pattern, checking, the habit of a man who's done enough of this to do it without thinking. Ned rode up alongside Gideon about 40 minutes out. He was 26. Dark-haired, with a face that still showed most of what he felt. Right now, it showed something between professional focus and barely managed nerves. "You think there'll be trouble on the road?" Ned asked. "I think there might be trouble everywhere today," Gideon said. "Stay steady." Ned nodded. He rode back to his position. Maeve said, quietly enough that only Gideon heard, "He's scared." "He's honest about it," Gideon said. "That's better than men who aren't scared and should be." She considered that for a moment. "You're not scared?" He thought about the honest answer. "I'm concerned," he said. "Scared would mean I thought there wasn't a good outcome possible. Concerned means I know there is, but I'm not certain we'll get there." She was quiet for a moment. "I think I skipped straight past scared into something worse," she said. "I don't know what to call it." "Determined," he said. "That's what it looks like from the outside." She didn't respond to that, but she sat a little straighter in the saddle. The Blackthorn Children's Home, what remained of it, sat at the end of a dirt track about a mile off the main road, behind a stand of cottonwood and pine that had partially sheltered the structure from the worst of the wind over the years, but had done nothing for the fire. What was left was stone foundation, charred timber, and ash. The walls that had stood 2 stories were now partial outlines. The upper sections collapsed inward, and the whole thing had the specific stillness of a place where something terrible had happened and the land hadn't absorbed it yet. Even the birds were quiet in the trees nearby. They stopped at the edge of the property. Beaumont, the surveyor, took out his notebook. Aldous, the clerk, uncapped his pen. Mercer scanned the ruins with the careful attention of someone reading a scene. Maeve dismounted. She stood for a moment looking at it. The place where she'd worked, the place that had burned, the place 2 people had died because of a man who was currently 6 miles behind them in a hotel room. Gideon watched her face and saw the memories moving through it like weather, fast and layered and complicated. East Courtyard, she said. Her voice was steady. Behind where the east wing stood, there was an old cottonwood. There. She pointed. Across the ruins, on the far side of what had been the main structure, a large cottonwood still stood, mostly undamaged by the fire, its trunk blackened on one side, but its upper branches full and living. "You're certain?" Mercer said. "I planted my hand against the bark when I dug," she said. "I know that tree." They moved around the outside of the ruins rather than through them. The burned structure was unstable, and Mercer made that call clearly. It added 10 minutes. Nobody argued. The cottonwood was in what had been a small enclosed courtyard. The east wall of the home had bounded it on 2 sides, and those walls were now collapsed rubble, but the space itself was still recognizable. Grass had grown up through the ash in the weeks since the fire. The ground near the tree roots was undisturbed. Maeve walked directly to a spot about 4 feet from the base of the trunk on the east side. She crouched down and pressed her hand against the ground. "Here," she said, "about 18 inches down, I had a short-handled spade, the kind the groundskeeper kept in the east shed." She looked up at Mercer. "The shed is gone, but the box is here." Beaumont produced a folding spade from his pack. He looked at Mercer, who nodded. Beaumont dug. The ground was hard in the first few inches, packed dirt and old roots, and soft beneath that where the digging had been done before and the earth hadn't fully resettled. Everyone stood back except Mercer, who crouched beside Beaumont and watched the depth carefully. Aldous had his pen ready. Harriet Wills stood with her arms crossed and her eyes fixed on the hole with the expression of someone who is not going to allow herself to hope until there's something solid to hope about. At 14 inches, the spade hit something that wasn't dirt. The sound was a dull clink, metal against metal, not loud, very final. Beaumont swept the dirt away with his hands and worked the spade around the edges, and 4 minutes later he lifted out a metal box roughly the size of a large book, sealed on 3 sides with a clasp and rusted slightly at the corners, but intact, completely intact. Maeve let out a breath. It was the only sound she made. Mercer took the box from Beaumont. He examined the clasp, still secure, and looked at Maeve. "You have the key?" "There's no key," she said. "I used a clasp, not a lock. I didn't have time for a lock. You just pull the clasp up, but it'll be stiff." Mercer worked the clasp. It was stiff, nearly fused with rust and dirt and whatever had seeped into the edges in the weeks underground. And he had to use both thumbs and real force before it pulled free with a scraping sound. He opened the box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had been tied closed with waxed cord, were the ledgers. 3 of them. 2 smaller notebooks and 1 large bound record book with a cracked leather cover. The oilcloth had done its job. When Mercer unwrapped them with careful hands and opened the large record book to the first page, the paper was dry. The ink was clear. The entries were legible. Aldous moved in immediately and began his documentation. Date, time, location, condition of the container, names of witnesses present. He wrote fast and precisely, the pen moving without hesitation. Mercer read the first page of the record book, then the second, then turned to a middle section and read that. His face through all of this remained controlled, but his jaw tightened once, briefly, on something he read. Just once. He closed the book. "Is it what she described?" Harriet Wills said. She had moved closer without anyone noticing. "And then some," Mercer said. He looked at Maeve. She was watching him with both hands at her sides and her chin level, waiting. "We need to go back to town," he said. "Now. All of us together." "Crow," she said. "He doesn't know we're here yet, or he didn't when we left, but if he has someone watching the road," a sound from the tree line to the north. "Not an animal. The wrong rhythm for an animal. Horses." Multiple horses moving at a controlled pace through the trees toward the open ground where they were standing. Mercer said, "Mount up." He said it in the voice of a Mtu, and everyone responded to the voice rather than to the fear underneath it, which was the correct outcome. Gideon was on his horse in 4 seconds. Maeve was already mounted. She'd moved the moment she heard the sound, before Mercer spoke, and he noted that and filed it. The Willses were slower but steady. Beaumont and Aldous scrambled. Ned had his hand on his sidearm. "Hold," Mercer said sharply to Ned. The riders came out of the tree line. There were 9 of them. Crow was in the center, on a gray horse, in his dark coat. He looked at the group assembled at the cottonwood with the particular expression of a man who has arrived at a moment he has planned for, but has found the variables have shifted against him. His eyes went to the metal box in Mercer's hand and stayed there. On either side of him were men Gideon recognized. Not all of them, but some. Fletcher was there, which was a sick feeling to add to everything else. 2 of the men were strangers in the clothes of hired hands, and they had the specific stillness of men paid to be present in situations that might require quick decisions. "Sheriff Mercer," Crow said. "Perfectly even. I'd like to know what you've dug up." "I'd like to know what you're doing at a fire scene with armed men," Mercer said. "Just as even. I followed you from Millhaven. I have an interest in whatever evidence is retrieved from this property." He looked at Maeve. "The woman who brought you here is a fugitive from a criminal investigation. Anything she's provided is tainted. Your criminal investigation," Mercer said, "conducted under authority you haven't held for 14 months. Something finally cracked in Crow's composure. A small crack, barely visible, but it was there. "I have temporary field authority. You have forged papers," Mercer said, "and we're going to discuss that at length when we get back to Millhaven. Right now, you're obstructing a legitimate law enforcement operation, and I'd recommend you step aside." Crow's horse shifted beneath him, and he steadied it with a hand that was not entirely steady. The 2 hired men on his flanks had moved, barely, in the way that armed men move when they're deciding whether a situation is going to require them to earn their money. Gideon put his hand on his rifle. He didn't draw it, he just put his hand on it. Ned did the same on the other side. Beaumont, behind them, said something very quietly to himself that was probably not appropriate for present company. "Fletcher," Gideon said without looking away from Crow, "go home." A long silence. He could hear Fletcher breathing, which told him Fletcher was close behind him and also not certain about where he'd ended up this morning. "Franklin," Gideon said, still without turning, "you have a wife and 3 sons and a feed mill that your father built. You know me. You know what I'm telling you right now." Another silence. Then the sound of a horse being turned. Then hooves heading back toward the tree line. Not just Fletcher, 2 other men with him, breaking off, deciding that whatever Crow had told them this morning wasn't worth what this had become. 6 men remaining with Crow. The 2 hired ones still hadn't moved. Maeve urged her horse forward. 1 step, 2, until she was beside Mercer, facing Crow directly across 20 feet of burned ground. "Mr. Crow," she said. He looked at her, and there, behind the composure, behind the careful construction of the controlled man, something moved that was neither patience nor authority. It was something older and uglier than either, fear dressed up as contempt. "You have 2 choices," she said. Her voice was carrying, not loud, but carrying, the voice of someone who has decided that what she's about to say is going to be heard regardless of what happens after. "You can try to stop us from leaving with those ledgers, in which case Sheriff Mercer arrests you today for obstruction and the forged credentials and whatever else he adds to the list. Or you can let us ride back to Millhaven, in which case the arrest takes a few hours longer and the outcome is identical." She paused. "There is no version of this morning where those ledgers don't reach the county seat. There is no version where the names in them stay hidden. The only variable you control right now is how much additional trouble you create for yourself in the next 5 minutes." Crow stared at her. The 2 hired men looked at each other. "I want those ledgers," Crow said. And now the evenness was gone. Not completely, but enough. The words had an edge under them that his earlier controlled speech hadn't. "Those records are stolen property and they do not leave this location. They're evidence in a child trafficking investigation," Maeve said, "and they leave with us. You have no authority." "She's with me," Mercer said flatly. "That's all the authority she needs." Crow moved, not toward Mercer, toward Maeve, fast and sudden, pushing his horse forward across the gap between them, one hand reaching. His intent wasn't entirely clear in the first second, whether he meant to grab the box from Mercer, or grab Maeve, or simply scatter the group by moving aggressively through the middle of it. He didn't get there. Ned's horse was between them before Gideon fully processed the motion, and Ned had his sidearm out and the barrel pointed at a precise and unmistakable angle. "Stop," Ned said. His voice shook. His hand didn't. Crow's horse lurched to a halt 2 feet from Ned's. Everyone was still. Gideon looked at Ned, the young deputy who had asked him on the road if there'd be trouble, whose face had shown his nerves openly and honestly. And he watched the young man hold the gun steady with both hands and hold Crow's gaze and not look away. "I will fire," Ned said, still shaking in the voice, not in the hands. "I will absolutely fire, sir. Please do not make me do that." The politeness of it was oddly the most authoritative thing in the whole frozen moment. One of the hired men lowered his hand from his holster. The other followed a second later. Crow looked at the gun, then at Ned, then at Mercer, then at Maeve. He did this slowly, and whatever he was calculating in his head during those seconds, exits, options, contingencies, landed finally on nothing useful. There was nothing useful left. "Get down from the horse," Mercer said to him. "Hands where I can see them." They rode back to Millhaven with Crow in custody, his wrists bound with rope from Beaumont's pack, riding between Ned and Mercer with the look of a man who is already thinking about lawyers. The 2 hired men had been disarmed and released. Mercer made the calculation that holding them complicated his ride back, and their testimony would be more useful later if they weren't already positioned as prisoners. Gideon rode alongside Maeve for most of the journey back. She didn't speak for the first half hour. He didn't push it. The road was mostly quiet, the wind picking up from the east, carrying the smell of rain that still hadn't arrived. When she did speak, it came out carefully, like she was testing how solid the ground was before putting weight on it. "He was going to take the box," she said. "He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Just reach out and take it." "Desperate men run out of sophistication," Gideon said. "He built all of that. The papers, the story, the time he spent in town shaping what people thought about me." She shook her head slightly. "And then when it fell apart, he just grabbed for it." "People like Crow plan very carefully up until the moment the plan doesn't work," Gideon said. "After that, it's reflex. And his reflex was reach." She was quiet again for a stretch. "Ned," she said. "I didn't expect Ned." "No." Gideon had been thinking about that too. "Neither did Ned, I suspect." She almost smiled. Millhaven looked different coming back into it with Crow in custody and the metal box in Mercer's saddlebag. Word had a way of moving in small towns that had nothing to do with telegraph or deliberate announcement. Something in the posture of the riders, maybe, or the particular quality of Crow's position between the 2 lawmen communicated to the men on the boardwalk and the woman at the dry goods window and the boy sweeping the hotel steps, something that brought people to the edge of the street to watch. Fletcher was somewhere in the crowd. Gideon didn't look for him. Mercer took Crow directly to the jail without ceremony and without speech, which was the correct move. There was nothing to announce yet, no case formally made, and creating spectacle before the thing was properly documented would give Crow's lawyers something to work with later. Aldous went with him to begin the formal record. Gideon and Maeve tied their horses outside the sheriff's office, and Gideon went in to wait while Maeve stayed on the porch for a moment, her back to the street, her hands on the porch railing. He came back out. "You all right?" he said. "People are looking at me," she said. "Yes." "Most of them spent the last 2 weeks thinking I was something terrible." "Most of them," he agreed. He leaned against the post beside her. "Some of them are starting to rearrange what they think." "That's a slow process," she said. "It is." She looked at the street. A woman across the way, someone Gideon vaguely knew as a neighbor of the Bennets, was watching Maeve with an expression that had moved from the hostile watchfulness of the previous week toward something uncertain. Not friendly, not apologetic, just uncertain. Like someone who has found that the story they'd been told doesn't fit the evidence and hasn't worked out what to do about the gap yet. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't even close. But it was the beginning of something. Harriet Wills appeared at Maeve's elbow, appearing from the direction of the livery with the unsettling efficiency of a woman who knows exactly where she needs to be and gets there without drawing attention to the process. "Aldous is doing his documentation," Harriet said. "Mercer wants you inside in 10 minutes to begin your formal statement." "I know," Maeve said. "Are you ready?" Maeve looked at her. "I've been ready since I woke up in Gideon's spare room not knowing my own name," she said. "This is the easy part." Harriet's expression did the small, genuine thing it had done the night before. "That's a strange definition of easy," she said. "All the hard parts already happened to me," Maeve said. "The part where I get to say it out loud is the part I've been waiting for." She went inside. The formal statement took 3 hours. Mercer conducted it with Aldous recording and Gideon present as a witness to the events at Silver Hollow. Maeve went through it start to finish without notes, without prompting beyond clarifying questions. And the thing that Gideon noticed, that he suspected Mercer noticed too, was the detail. The kind of detail that doesn't come from someone constructing a story. It came from someone who had lived inside the events and was reporting from memory. Imperfect and non-linear in places, correcting herself twice when the sequence of 2 specific events was wrong before getting it right, the way honest memory actually works. She named 18 buyers from the ledgers. She named them with dates and amounts and the names of the children transferred. She described the system Crow had established, the coded entries in the primary ledger that looked like livestock or supply purchases when read by anyone who didn't know the key, and the secondary notebook that contained the key itself. When she was finished, Mercer sat back in his chair and looked at what Aldous had filled up. 6 pages of close writing. "You said 18 buyers," Mercer said. 18 that I remember clearly. There may be more in the ledgers that I didn't read carefully. Some of those names are in this county. I know. Some of them are significant men. I know that too. Her voice was very level. That's why Crow burned the building. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. "This is going above me," he said. "You understand that. This goes to the territorial authority and possibly to federal. It's too large for a county sheriff to hold alone." "I understand. Which means it's going to take time. More time than you'd like." "It's been taking time since those children disappeared," Maeve said. "A little more time doesn't change what happened to them. It only changes whether anyone pays for it." Mercer picked up the ledger and looked at its cover. "I'm going to keep you and Vance close until I've got the right people coming from the territorial capital," he said. "I don't want you on the road alone. Crow had 2 hired men at Blackthorn. I released them, and I don't know who else he might have working for him." "He won't," Maeve said. "Whatever he had, it was built on his authority and his resources and his story. Those are gone. Men who hired on for someone with power don't stay hired when the power disappears. You sound certain of that." "I've spent 2 years watching how Crow operated," she said. "He kept people through fear of consequences, not through loyalty. The consequences are his now." Mercer nodded slowly. He almost said something more, and then stopped, and Gideon watched him make the decision to trust what she'd said rather than argue against it. "All right," he said. "Tonight you stay in town. I'll arrange rooms at the hotel. Tomorrow I send the wire to the capital." He paused. "It's going to be a different kind of week than the one you've been having." "I can handle a different kind of week," Maeve said. She said it plainly, without drama, the way she said most things. But Gideon heard something in it that was different from the voice she'd been using for 3 hours of formal statement. Something that was closer to relief than anything else, though not fully that either. Not relief at being saved. Relief at having done the thing that needed doing and done it well enough that it was going to hold. That was its own kind of weight coming off. The hotel was the same one where Crow had been staying, which was an irony that nobody mentioned and everyone noticed. Mercer arranged 2 rooms, one for Maeve, one for Gideon, and Gideon sent Doss a message with a boy he paid a nickel who knew the roads telling him what had happened and to keep Lottie at Silver Hollow tonight, and he'd be back by midday tomorrow. He ate supper in the hotel dining room with Maeve and the Willses and tried to remember the last time he'd eaten in a restaurant and couldn't. Lottie would have found the place extraordinary. She'd never been to the hotel dining room. He made a note to bring her someday when things had settled, which felt for the first time in 2 weeks like a thing that might actually happen. Harriet Wills ate with the determined efficiency of a woman who has been busy all day and intends to restore her strength fully before tomorrow. Clem ate quietly and steadily. Dara had color in her face that hadn't been there in the morning. Not happiness exactly, but the look of someone who has done something frightening and found, on the other side of it, that they were still standing. Maeve picked at her food. Gideon noticed but didn't say anything. The body does strange things after sustained stress releases. Sometimes it can't eat, sometimes it shakes, sometimes it sleeps for 14 hours. He'd seen enough of it in enough situations to recognize the pattern. "Eat something," he said quietly. "I'm trying." "You don't have to try hard, just something." She ate half the plate. It wasn't enough, but it was something, and he let it go. After supper, the Willses went to their rooms. Gideon and Maeve sat on the hotel porch for a while in the dark, the main street of Millhaven doing its late evening thing around them. A few men coming out of the saloon, a lantern being lit in the window of the general store for whatever late inventory work the owner did, a dog doing approximately the same thing the morning dog had been doing in the street, which was lying down and intending to stay. "I keep thinking about something you said," Maeve said. Back at Silver Hollow. The first night. What's that? You said some things you can't close back up after you open them. She turned the phrase over. Is that how you feel about this? He thought about it honestly. About you being here? About all of it. The ranch isn't the same as it was 2 weeks ago. Lottie's different. You've taken on trouble that wasn't yours to take. I found you in my creek bed, he said. That made it mine. It didn't have to. No, he agreed, but it did. She was quiet for a moment. Lottie, she said, she's going to be okay? She's better than okay, Gideon said. She's the best thing I've got. She picked me, Maeve said. It came out a little unsteady. She just looked at me and picked me. She had no reason to. She had every reason, Gideon said. She just couldn't explain the reasoning yet. Maeve pressed her hand against her mouth for a moment, and he understood she was holding something in, and he wasn't going to make her do otherwise by looking at her too directly, so he looked at the street. After a moment, she said, I haven't cried yet, not once since I woke up in your house. I know. I don't know what I'm waiting for. Sometimes it waits until you're safe enough for it to happen, he said. Your body knows when. Another quiet spell. Gideon. Her voice had something in it he hadn't heard before. Not weakness, nothing like that. Just the sound of someone arriving somewhere after a very long walk and not being sure they trust the ground yet. Yeah, thank you. For the sack, and for the name, and for Mercer, and for all of it. She paused. I won't say it again because it gets smaller every time you repeat it, but once. Thank you. He turned to look at her. You're welcome, he said. Once. She nodded, and the thing she'd been holding in was still being held, but more easily now, and they sat in the quiet together while Millhaven finished its evening and the stars did their work above the buildings, and the case that would take weeks to properly unfold sat secured in a metal box in the sheriff's office, documented and witnessed and legally handled, and no longer something Crow or anyone else could make disappear. He didn't know yet what came after this, but the night was quiet and Maeve was here, and tomorrow he'd go home to Lottie. That was enough for right now. The wire Mercer sent to the territorial capital on Thursday morning brought 2 men by Saturday afternoon, which was faster than anyone expected, and told Gideon something about how the names in those ledgers had landed when read by someone with the authority to act on them. Their names were Hargrove and Poole, senior investigators from the Territorial Attorney General's office. Neither of them the kind of men who explained themselves much or made small talk. Hargrove was older, maybe 55, with a white mustache and the patient, worn quality of someone who has spent decades looking at the worst that people do to each other and has stopped being surprised by it but hasn't stopped caring, which was its own kind of endurance. Poole was younger and faster and took notes constantly, his pen moving even when nothing appeared to be happening. They read the ledgers in Mercer's office with the door closed. They were in there for 4 hours. Gideon and Maeve waited on the porch. Mercer came out twice to check on them and went back in. Doss had come in from Silver Hollow with Lottie. Gideon had sent another message that morning, and Lottie was currently sitting on the step below Maeve's feet, leaning back against her legs with the complete confidence of a child who has decided this is where she belongs and sees no reason to explain herself. Maeve had her hand resting lightly on top of Lottie's head. She wasn't doing it deliberately, or maybe she was and didn't know it. Either way, she didn't move it. Doss sat on the hitching post with his arms folded and his hat pulled low, doing the thing he did best, which was being present without requiring anyone to account for him. Are they going to arrest people? Lottie asked. Yes, Maeve said. Today? Probably not today. These things take time to do correctly. Lottie considered this. Why does doing it correctly take longer? Because when you do it correctly, it stays done, Maeve said. If you rush, people find ways to undo it. Lottie seemed to accept this as reasonable. She pulled up a piece of the porch board that was already loose and examined what was under it with the focused interest she brought to most things. There's a beetle, she reported. Leave it alone, Gideon said. I wasn't going to hurt it. I was just looking. It doesn't know that, Gideon said. Lottie put the board back. That's fair, she said. Hargrove came out at 3 in the afternoon, leaving Poole inside still writing. He stood on the porch and looked at Maeve with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, just the evaluating attention of someone doing an assessment. He had the ledgers tucked under his arm. Miss Rourke, he said, I want you to walk me through the secondary notebook, the one with the coding key. I need to understand how the entries were structured before Blackthorn implemented it. All right, Maeve said. She looked down at Lottie. Lottie had already turned around and was watching Hargrove with the same evaluating attention he'd used on Maeve, which Hargrove noticed and which produced the first thing approaching an expression on his face. A slight upward shift at one corner of his mouth that disappeared immediately. "I'll be inside," Maeve told Lottie. "I'll be here," Lottie said, as if confirming that her post would be held. They worked through the afternoon. Gideon was present for part of it. Hargrove asked him to confirm the timeline of finding Maeve, the visit from Crow, the ride to Blackthorn, the confrontation, and his account was added to Poole's growing record. At one point, Hargrove set down the secondary notebook and looked at Maeve across Mercer's desk. "You memorize these," he said. "Not intentionally," she said. "I was trying to understand what I was reading. Understanding things tends to fix them in my head." "You've given us 18 names from memory. We've verified 14 of them against the ledger entries. The other 4 are in there too. I was testing the accuracy." He paused. "You're not wrong about any of them." Maeve said nothing. "Some of these men are well established," Hargrove said. He wasn't making an argument, just stating a fact, laying out the landscape. There will be legal resistance, resources spent on defense. This will not move quickly through the courts. "I know," she said. "Your testimony will be central. You'll be asked to appear multiple times. It may take years before all of it is resolved." "I know that too." Hargrove looked at her steadily. "You're not going to tell me that's fine," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. "It's not fine," Maeve said. "It's just what it is." She met his eyes. Those children were placed in labor arrangements between 2 and 6 years ago in some cases. For the ones who are still in those situations, every month that passes matters. I know the legal process takes time. I'm also asking you to move as fast as the law allows." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "We'll issue the first warrants this week," he said. "For the men we can reach quickly. The others will take longer." He picked up the ledger. "I want to be direct with you about something, Miss Rourke. The men in this book include a territorial judge and 2 county commissioners. That complicates the process considerably." Maeve looked at him without flinching. "It also means you have to get it right," she said, "because if you move on men like that and it falls apart in court, they'll spend the rest of their lives calling me a liar and nobody will look at those children again." "Exactly," Hargrove said. He closed the ledger, "which is why your testimony has to be airtight and why I'm asking you not to speak publicly about the specific names until we've moved on them. Can you do that?" "Yes." He nodded once. "Good." They stayed in Millhaven 2 more days while Hargrove and Poole finished their work, and Mercer coordinated with them on the local end. Gideon and Lottie stayed at the hotel. Maeve was in and out of Mercer's office so many times that by the second day, she'd started making her own coffee in the small pot he kept on the wood stove, which Mercer observed without comment, and which Gideon suspected was its own kind of acceptance. Lottie spent those 2 days absorbing Millhaven with the systematic attention of someone on a research expedition. She asked Doss to take her to the livery, where she evaluated every horse present with great seriousness. She asked the woman at the bakery about the bread and received a 15-minute explanation that she listened to in its entirety, asking follow-up questions. She sat on the hotel porch and watched the street and reported her observations to Gideon each evening with the thoroughness of a correspondent filing a dispatch. The man at the dry goods store waves to everyone who passes but only actually means it for some of them, she told him on the second evening. "You can tell because his hand is different." "What's different about it?" "When he means it, his whole arm moves. When he doesn't, just his hand. His arm stays still." Gideon looked at his daughter for a long moment. "You sat there watching that all afternoon?" "I was also watching other things," Lottie said fairly. He thought about what Lottie had said at Silver Hollow the morning Maeve came home from town. She was scared, but she didn't look it. He thought about Clara, who used to say Lottie noticed too much, and he thought that Clara had been right, and that she had also been right that it wasn't a bad thing. I was going to have to figure out what to do with a child who saw everything. He was also, for the first time in 3 years, looking forward to the problem. They went home on a Tuesday. Silver Hollow looked the same as it always had. The low hills behind it, the barn in need of paint on the south side, the fence line Doss had been meaning to finish reinforcing for 2 weeks. Gideon's horse knew the smell of the place and walked the last quarter mile with a different energy than it had carried on the road. Maeve was quiet riding in, looking at the ranch with the expression of someone seeing a place they've been away from and finding it still there. She'd been back for 6 days, technically, But 6 days of it had been about survival and testimony and crow and ledgers and the heavy bureaucratic machinery of justice beginning to turn. This was the first time she was coming back to Silver Hollow as something other than a woman in crisis. Lottie slid off her horse before Gideon had fully stopped and ran to the porch and went inside and came back out immediately. "Everything is exactly the same," she announced. "Doss fed the chickens." "I told him to," Gideon said. "The barn cat had her kittens," Lottie said. She looked at Gideon with an expression of strategic patience. "3 of them." "I know. They're going to need homes." "Lottie." "Not right now," she said. "I'm just noting it for the future." Maeve had dismounted and was standing in the yard looking at the cottonwood beyond the fence line, the big leaning one by the dry creek bed where Gideon had found her. She stood with her arms at her sides and her back straight, and Gideon watched her look at it for a long moment with an expression he couldn't read from where he stood. He led the horses to the barn. When he came back out, she was on the porch. "You all right?" he said. "I was looking at the tree," she said. "I know. It's strange." She turned and leaned against the porch post. "I was so angry when I first remembered what happened to me there. At the creek, I mean. I was angry for days afterward. Not just at Crow, at the whole fact of it. Being put in a sack like something to be disposed of." She paused. "Now I look at that tree and all I think is that Lottie was on the other side of it." Gideon sat on the porch step. "That's a better thing to think." "It is." She looked at the yard, the fence, the barn, the hills behind it. "Gideon, yeah. I need to figure out what comes next. For me, She stopped, tried again. "You took me in because I was injured and Lottie asked you to, and it was the decent thing. That's done now. Things are in motion that don't require me to be here specifically." She said it carefully, without accusation or self-pity, just laying it out the way she laid everything out, plainly, with both hands visible. "I could go somewhere else. I have a name now. I could rebuild something." He looked at her. "Could," he said. "Yes." "Do you want to?" A pause. "That's a complicated question." "It's not a complicated question," he said. "The answer might be complicated. The question is simple." She looked at him with the directness that had unsettled him a little in the beginning. That quality of actually looking, not at a surface version, but at the thing underneath. "What are you asking me, Gideon?" He picked up a pebble from the step and turned it over in his hand. "I'm asking if you want to stay," he said. "Not because of the case, or because Lottie needs you, or because you don't have another option. I'm asking if you want to be here." A long moment. "Yes," she said. Quiet and plain, and with no additional words around it. "Then stay," he said. She looked at him for another moment, then nodded once and went inside to start supper. And that was that. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing about the Blackthorn investigation moved cleanly. Hargrove had promised it would take time, and he was correct. The first warrants went out in the second week. 3 men, 2 of them ranchers, one of them a business owner in Crestfield who had purchased the labor of 4 children over 2 years and was currently insisting, through 2 lawyers, that he had believed them to be legally apprenticed workers. The 4th warrant was for the territorial judge named in the ledgers. That one made the newspaper in the capital, and the newspaper account made its way to Millhaven, and Mercer brought the paper out to Silver Hollow and left it on the kitchen table without comment. Maeve read it twice, standing up, then folded it and put it down. "How does it feel?" Gideon asked. "Like watching a very large, very slow machine start moving," she said, "and hoping it doesn't stop." "Hargrove won't let it stop," he said. "Hargrove is one man," she said. "But yes, I think he won't." The search parties went out in the 3rd week, organized through the Attorney General's office with Hargrove coordinating across multiple counties. The process of finding and recovering children from the labor arrangements in the Blackthorn ledgers was painstaking and not always successful. Some placements were empty. The children had moved on, either aged out or relocated in ways that left thin paper trails. Some were found quickly, some required legal negotiation with employers who had convinced themselves they were doing nothing wrong. Maeve followed every development Mercer brought to her and kept her own accounting of it in a notebook she'd bought from the general store. Children's names on one page, status on the facing page, updated as information came in. She did it methodically, without drama, the way she mended things. Steady hands, 1 stitch at a time. Gideon watched her do it and said nothing, and understood that this was not something that needed commenting on. She was finishing what she'd started. That was simply who she was. By the end of the first month, 11 children had been located and removed from their placements. 7 of them had nowhere to go. their families of origin either unknown or unable to take them, their situations entirely unmapped outside of Blackthorn's records. It was Maeve who first raised the question of what happened to those 7. She raised it at supper on a Wednesday evening in a way that was clearly not the first time she'd been thinking about it. The thought had shape and edges, had been turned over enough to be solid. The Attorney General's office can place them with county families temporarily, she said, but temporary means uncertain, and uncertain is... That's what they already had. Gideon set down his fork. Lottie was watching Maeve with both elbows on the table and her chin in her hands. "What do you want to do?" Gideon said. "I want to ask you something that isn't a small ask," Maeve said. She looked at him directly. "I want to ask if Silver Hollow could take some of them. Not all 7. We couldn't manage 7 right now, and it wouldn't be fair to Lottie to turn her home into something she didn't consent to. But maybe 2. Or 3. She paused. "Children who need somewhere stable, somewhere they can stay long enough to matter." Lottie lifted her chin out of her hands. "I consent," she said. Both adults looked at her. "I know I'm 5, Lottie said, "but I consent." Gideon looked at Maeve. Maeve looked back at him. "It's your ranch," she said. "Your life. Your daughter. It's your idea," he said. "That doesn't make it your obligation." "Maeve." He picked up his fork again and used it to gesture vaguely at the table, the kitchen, the ranch outside the window. "You think I don't have room?" She understood what he meant. Not square footage. The other kind of room. The kind that opens up when you decide to let something in. "I'll write to Hargrove in the morning," she said. "Do that," he said. Lottie put her chin back in her hands with the expression of someone who has successfully navigated a negotiation and is too dignified to show how pleased she is. The trial of Silas Crow opened 6 weeks after his arrest and ran for 9 days. Maeve testified on the 3rd day and the 4th. Gideon drove her to the county seat in the wagon and sat in the gallery for both days. He watched her take the stand and answer questions for 4 hours on the 3rd day and 3 hours on the 4th, and he watched the defense lawyer try 6 different approaches to undermining her account, and he watched Maeve answer each approach the same way, directly, specifically, without elaboration or defensiveness, correcting herself once when she had a date slightly wrong, which the defense lawyer tried to use as an opening and which Maeve calmly closed by providing the correct date from memory. The jury was out for less than a day. Crow was convicted on 3 counts, with additional charges related to the children's placements to be tried separately as the investigation broadened. The sentencing was set for 30 days out. Outside the courthouse, in the late afternoon of the verdict day, Maeve stood on the steps with Gideon and breathed the particular air of a place where something has just concluded. She wasn't crying. He hadn't expected her to be. "It's not finished," she said. "No," he agreed. "The others. The other men in the ledgers, the judge, the county commissioners, those trials will take months." She exhaled. "And the children who haven't been found yet. I know. I'm not dissatisfied," she said carefully. "I want you to understand that. Crow is convicted. That matters. It matters an enormous amount. You're keeping the accounting," he said. "Yes." He stood beside her on the courthouse steps while the late afternoon light came at an angle across the square, and the people around them moved in and out of the courthouse with the business of their various legal matters, none of which were as large as what had just concluded inside, though you couldn't tell that from looking. "Maeve," he said. "Yeah?" "It's all right to be satisfied about what you can be satisfied about," he said. "The accounting doesn't stop you from that. They can exist at the same time." She turned and looked at him. "Clara teach you that?" she said, not unkind, genuinely asking. "She tried," he said. "Took me a while to actually learn it." Something moved across Maeve's face that was complicated and layered and real. She looked back at the square. "I had an idea on the drive here," she said, "about the 2 children Hargrove is sending to Silver Hollow next week." "What's that?" "The boy, Thomas, he's 9. He's been in a labor placement since he was 7. He probably has no formal schooling." She paused. "I can read and I can figure. I can teach him. And the girl, her name is Wren, she's 8. Hargrove said she hasn't spoken much since she was recovered. I don't know if that means she can't or won't, but I know that being somewhere quiet and safe and having a real job to do helps. I was thinking she might learn the chickens." "She might," Gideon said. "Lottie already knows the chickens. She could show her." "She'd be honored," he said. Maeve nodded. She was doing the organizing thing, taking something overwhelming and breaking it into pieces she could carry. He recognized it because she'd been doing it since the morning she'd sat at his kitchen table and said, "I already know what we're doing." "We should get back," she said. Lottie will have driven Doss to his limit by now. "She's been asking him about the fence all week," Gideon confirmed. "He's very patient with her." "He loves her," Gideon said simply. "Has since she was born. He won't ever say it because that's not how Doss works, but he does." They walked to the wagon. Thomas arrived 9 days after the verdict, brought by a county worker who handed Hargrove's paperwork to Gideon at the gate and drove away with the brisk efficiency of a man with too many stops on his route. Thomas stood at the gate with a canvas bag that held everything he owned, which wasn't much, and looked at Silver Hollow with the particular blankness of a child who has learned not to let places mean anything until he knows if they'll keep him. He was small for 9, thin, with a careful way of standing that made him look like he was always slightly braced for something. Gideon crouched to his level. "I'm Gideon Vance," he said. "This is Silver Hollow. You'll have a room and a bed and food and work that's appropriate for someone your size. Nobody here is going to hurt you." Thomas looked at him with eyes that had done a great deal of calculating in 9 years. "How do I know?" he said. "You don't yet," Gideon said. "You'll know after a while." Thomas looked past him toward the porch. Maeve was there, and beside her was Lottie, who was vibrating with the effort of not running to the gate immediately and was managing it only because Maeve had a light hand on her shoulder. "Who's the little one?" Thomas said. "That's Lottie. She's 5 and she'll talk your ear off if you let her. She also knows everything about the ranch chickens." Thomas looked at Lottie. Lottie looked back at him with the focused attention she gave to everything important. "I used to help with chickens," Thomas said. Carefully, like it might be the wrong thing to say. "Then you're ahead of where most people start," Gideon said. He stood and opened the gate, and Thomas walked through it with his canvas bag and his careful posture, and Lottie broke free of Maeve's hand and came down the porch steps at a controlled run and stopped 2 feet from Thomas with enormous and unusual restraint. "I'm Lottie," she said. "There are 3 new kittens in the barn, but they're too small to hold yet. I'll show you when they're ready. Do you like eggs? We have a lot of eggs." Thomas stared at her. "Yes," he said. "I like eggs." "Good," Lottie said. "Come on." She turned and walked toward the barn, and after a moment, Thomas followed her, still holding his canvas bag, with something in his face that wasn't hope yet. It was too early for hope, but might have been the first very small crack in the wall he'd built against it. Maeve stood on the porch and watched them go. Gideon came up beside her. "Wren comes next week," she said. "I know. I need to set up the second room properly before then. The curtains in there are terrible, and children need decent curtains." "Do they?" "Yes," she said, with the firmness of someone who has thought about this. "They need to know someone made the room ready for them specifically. Curtains that someone chose matter." He had not previously had opinions about curtains. He suspected he was about to develop some. "All right," he said. "What color?" She looked at him. A ghost of something passed through her face. Not quite amusement, not quite tenderness, somewhere between the two, where the real things usually lived. "Something that doesn't look institutional," she said. "Something that looks like a home." From inside the barn came the sound of Lottie's voice, explaining something at length and in detail, and the quieter sound of a 9-year-old boy beginning very cautiously to listen. Wren arrived 6 days later, smaller than Thomas and quieter, genuinely quiet, not strategically so. She had a way of watching things without appearing to, her gaze sliding sideways to catch details while she seemed to be looking at the middle distance. She didn't speak on the first day or the second. She ate what was put in front of her and stayed close to walls and watched. On the 3rd morning, Maeve took her to the chicken coop. Lottie came along because Lottie went along to most things, but she had been quietly briefed by Maeve, a brief, clear conversation the night before in which Maeve said simply, "She's frightened and she doesn't show it. Just be near her without asking her things. Let her do things without explaining them." Lottie had nodded with the seriousness of someone receiving real instruction and had not asked unnecessary questions, which was its own kind of growth. The 3 of them went to the coop. Maeve showed Wren how to check for eggs, where the hens laid outside the boxes, the stubborn ones, the hidden spots in the back corner. She showed her how to hold the egg so it didn't break and how to tell by the weight if something was wrong with it. Wren watched. She didn't speak. But her hands, when Maeve showed her the motion, did the motion correctly. On the 4th day, Wren went to the coop by herself before anyone had asked her to. She came back with 6 eggs in her apron, held carefully, none broken. She put them on the kitchen table and looked at Maeve without speaking. "Good work," Maeve said. Just that. Wren went back outside. Maeve stood at the kitchen table with 6 eggs in front of her and her hand pressed flat on the surface and her eyes looking at the window. Not through it, just at it, and Gideon, who had seen this from the hallway, went to the kitchen and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one near her without saying anything. She picked it up. They stood there for a moment in the ordinary morning of Silver Hollow, with the sound of Thomas and Lottie in the yard doing something that involved a great deal of negotiation about whose turn it was, and Doss in the barn making the specific sounds of a man who has found something broken and is assessing how badly. "She'll talk," Maeve said, "when she's ready." "I know," Gideon said. "It might take a long time. Probably." Maeve drank her coffee. "I was thinking," she said, "about the accounting, the one I keep." She paused. "I need to add a column." "What column?" "The one for children found," she said. "Not just located, actually found. Somewhere real." He understood what she meant. Found wasn't the same as located. Located meant a county worker had identified them. Found meant something had come for them that wasn't another arrangement to get through. "Add it," he said. She nodded and put down the coffee cup and went to the table where she kept the notebook. He watched her open it and turn to the facing page opposite the status column and draw a careful line down the middle and right at the top of the new column in her clear, steady hand, 2 words. He didn't need to read them to know what they said. He already knew. Wren spoke for the first time on a Thursday morning 5 weeks after she arrived. She said 3 words. Maeve was in the kitchen making the morning oatmeal, the thick kind that Thomas had decided was his favorite thing Silver Hollow produced, a preference he'd stated with such careful, measured certainty that it had clearly been a preference he'd held privately for some time before trusting it to words. Wren came in from the chicken coop with the eggs the way she did every morning now and set them on the table, and then she stood there for a moment longer than usual, and Maeve waited, without turning from the stove because she'd learned that Wren needed to not be looked at directly when something was happening. "It's cold out," Wren said. 3 words, flat, a little rusty, like a door that hadn't been used in a while. Maeve stirred the oatmeal. "It is," she said. "Winter's moving in. You'll need the heavier coat from the peg by the door tomorrow." A pause. "Okay," Wren said. She sat down at the table. Maeve kept stirring and did not make anything of the moment and did not look at Wren and felt something large and quiet move through her chest that she also did not make anything of, because Wren was still in the room and the moment belonged to Wren, not to her. When Gideon came in 20 minutes later, Maeve was serving oatmeal and Wren was eating, and Thomas was explaining to Lottie at considerable length why the south pasture fence needed a different kind of post than the north pasture fence, information he had acquired from Doss over the preceding week and was now deploying with the authority of someone who has just learned something and finds it urgent to share. Gideon poured his coffee and looked at Maeve. She gave him the smallest possible nod. I understood immediately. He sat down and didn't say anything to Wren that was different from any other morning, which was exactly correct, and Maeve thought, not for the first time, that Gideon Vance was a man who understood when to be quiet and what that silence was worth, and that this was rarer than most people recognized. The second trial opened in November. This one was broader. 4 defendants, including the territorial judge whose name had been in the ledgers and whose lawyers had spent 3 months trying to suppress the ledger evidence on procedural grounds and had failed at each attempt. The judge's name was Aldred Combs, and by the time the trial opened, the newspapers in the capital had been writing about him for 6 weeks, and the territory had formed a fairly clear opinion. Maeve testified again. This time, the defense lawyers were better. More expensive, more aggressive, with a strategy that focused less on disproving her account and more on suggesting she was a woman with a personal grievance constructing a narrative to satisfy it. They used the word narrative 11 times in their opening argument. Maeve counted. She was on the stand for 2 full days. The cross-examination on the second day was the hardest thing she had done since the burlap sack, which was saying something. The defense lawyer, a man named Stills who had the smooth, relentless quality of someone who has spent decades reducing people to their least defensible moments, went at her memory, her credibility, her employment record, and eventually with the particular cruelty of someone who has run out of better options, her history as an orphan. "You were yourself a ward of a state institution as a child," Stills said, "placed out as a minor worker." "Yes," Maeve said, "so you have a personal and emotional investment in the outcome of this case that goes beyond mere observation." "Yes," Maeve said. Stills paused, clearly expecting more. An objection, a deflection, something to work against. He got nothing, so he pressed. "And you don't think that personal investment affects your account?" "Of course it does," Maeve said. "It's why I took the ledgers in the first place. It's why I ran with them instead of leaving them behind when I had the chance." It's why I buried them where they'd survive instead of just hiding myself. She looked at him steadily. You're asking if I cared about what I was testifying to. I did. I do. I don't know why you'd expect a witness to something terrible not to care about it. A murmur in the gallery. Stills shifted his approach. You're asking this jury to believe your memory over 2 years of documented institutional records. I'm asking this jury to believe the ledgers, Maeve said, which I recovered and which have been authenticated by 3 independent document examiners. My memory is corroborated by the ledgers. The ledgers don't have a personal investment. Stills looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man recalculating. He sat down. Gideon, in the gallery, exhaled so quietly that the woman next to him didn't hear it. The jury deliberated for 2 days on the second trial. Combs was convicted. 2 of the other 3 defendants were convicted. The 4th, a rancher named Elias Thorne, who had purchased the labor of 2 boys 4 years earlier, was acquitted on a technicality related to the documentation chain for his specific ledger entry, a result that Hargrove told Maeve afterward was deeply frustrating but legally sound. She sat with that for a day. Then she added his name to the accounting notebook under a separate column headed Unresolved, which she had created 3 weeks earlier because she'd known there would be cases that didn't go all the way through and she needed somewhere to put them that wasn't closed. It doesn't feel like enough, she told Gideon that evening. It's not enough, he said. It's what we got. Thorne goes back to his ranch. Those boys are already gone from his property. They were recovered months ago, but he walks back to his life. Yes, that's unjust. Yes, he said again. It is. She looked at him. You're not going to tell me something hopeful. You don't want something hopeful right now, he said. You want someone to agree that it's unjust. It is. I agree. She was quiet for a moment, then, thank you for not trying to fix it. I can't fix it, he said. I can just be here while it's unfixed. She picked up the notebook and looked at the unresolved column and then set it down. Thorne has a daughter, she said. She's 12. She came to the trial with her mother. A pause. She watched the whole thing, every day. Gideon waited. I don't know what she understood, Maeve said, but she was paying attention. She paused again. Children who pay attention turn into adults who act on what they noticed, sometimes. If someone showed them, it was worth it. She picked up the notebook again and added a second column beside Unresolved. She labeled it Watching. She didn't explain what she meant. She didn't need to. Crow was sentenced in December, the same week the first snow came to Silver Hollow, 12 years. The judge at sentencing used language that made the newspapers, something about the deliberate exploitation of the most vulnerable, and the particular moral vacancy of a man who had converted the machinery of child protection into its opposite. Maeve read the account Mercer brought out to the ranch and then folded the paper and put it in the kitchen drawer where she kept things she needed to keep but didn't need to look at again immediately. 12 years, Thomas said that evening. He'd read the paper before Maeve folded it. He was reading well now. After 2 months of lessons at the kitchen table, moving through sentences with the focused determination of someone making up for lost time. Is that a long time? For some things, Maeve said. Is it enough? She looked at him. Thomas at 9 asked questions that landed harder than most adults because he had no protective layer of learned social delicacy. He just asked what he wanted to know. No, she said. It's not enough for what he did, but it's what the law gave, and the law is what we have. She paused. The children who were in those ledgers, most of them are somewhere real now. That matters more than the number. Thomas thought about this. Most, he said. Most, she confirmed. We haven't found everyone. He nodded slowly, not satisfied, not dissatisfied, processing. He'd learned, in 2 months at Silver Hollow, that Maeve would tell him the truth of things rather than the comfortable version, and he had responded to this by trusting her in a way that was different from the careful watchfulness he offered most adults, more direct, more willing to push back. Will you keep looking? He said. Yes, she said. Even after all the trials are done? Yes. He considered. Okay, he said. Then, the oatmeal's going to be done. He went to check it. Lottie, who had been listening from her stool in the corner, looked at Maeve with Clara's gray-brown eyes. I knew you'd say yes, Lottie said. Did you? Maeve said. You always say yes to the things that matter. Lottie hopped off her stool. I'm going to go check on Wren. She's been in the barn a long time. She went. Maeve stood in the kitchen with the stove heat behind her and the snow coming down outside the window, and the sounds of Silver Hollow moving around her in the ordinary way it did. The creak of the house, the horses in the barn, Doss's footsteps on the porch, and she felt the particular weight and texture of a life that was genuinely hers. She hadn't had one of those in a long time. She wasn't certain she'd ever had one. Gideon proposed in February. He did it badly, which was appropriate, because he was not a man who did things like this smoothly, and any version that had come out polished would have felt wrong to both of them. He'd been thinking about it for 3 months. He'd thought about the right moment, the right words, the right circumstance, and had concluded after 3 months of this that there was no right version, and the only thing to do was say it. They were in the barn. She was helping him with a horse that had pulled up lame in the left foreleg. She'd developed a practical knowledge of the horses over the months, the way she developed practical knowledge of most things, by paying attention until she understood. She was holding the horse steady while he worked the leg, and the barn was warm and smelled like hay and horse and the particular cold of a February evening held back by 4 walls. "Maeve," he said. "I want to ask you something. You're asking me right now to hold the horse steady," she said. "I'm doing that." "Something else." She looked at him over the horse's back. He set the leg down and straightened and looked at her with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is committed to it regardless of how the execution goes. "I'd like to marry you," he said. "Not because of the children or the ranch or any reason that's about practical arrangements, because of," he stopped, "because of who you are, because of how you are, because I've watched you for 7 months do the hardest things I've ever seen someone do, and I've watched you do them without pretending they were easier than they were, and without letting them make you smaller." And he stopped again. "I'm not saying this well." "No," she said. "You're really not." "I know. Keep going anyway," she said. He looked at her. "I love you," he said. Simpler. Just that. She was quiet for a moment with her hands on the horse's neck and her eyes on Gideon and the barn, holding them both in its February warmth. "I love you too," she said. "I've been waiting for you to get around to this for 2 months. 2 months, he said. "At least," she said. "I wasn't going to say it first because," she paused, "because this is your house and your life and your daughter, and I needed it to be yours to offer, not mine to ask for." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's a very complicated way to love someone," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know. Are you going to keep working on the horse or not?" He crouched back down and went back to work, and she held the horse steady, and neither of them said anything more about it that evening because nothing more needed saying. They married in April, on a Saturday, in the yard of Silver Hollow, with Mercer standing up for Gideon, and Harriet Will standing up for Maeve, and Thomas and Wren and Lottie in the front. Lottie in the dress she'd chosen herself with great deliberation, Thomas in his first good shirt, Wren holding a bunch of early wildflowers she'd gathered from the north pasture without being asked. Doss stood at the back with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who finds this entirely appropriate and is not going to say so aloud. Ray Bennett came, which Gideon noted. The Willses came, all 3 of them. A few neighbors whose opinions had quietly shifted in the months since Blackthorn, not dramatically, not with apology exactly, but in the small ways people show they've reconsidered, coming to the fence to talk, stopping by with things from their farms, asking after Thomas and Wren, with the slightly careful interest of people who aren't sure of the etiquette but mean well. The ceremony was short because both of them had agreed that long ceremonies were mostly for the benefit of the audience, and their audience was primarily a 9-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 6-year-old, none of whom could be expected to hold still indefinitely. Mercer read the words. They said the ones they were supposed to say. Lottie cried, which surprised her enormously. She clapped her hand over her mouth and stared at them with wide eyes as if her own face had done something unauthorized. "I'm not sad," she announced, alarmed. "I know," Maeve said. "Sometimes that happens." "That's very confusing," Lottie said. "Yes," Maeve agreed. "It is." She was smiling when she said it. The real kind. The 3rd child came in June. Her name was Pearl, and she was 11, and she arrived in a different state than Thomas and Wren had. Not frightened so much as furious. A white-hot and entirely justified fury at the chain of events that had deposited her at Silver Hollow with a canvas bag and someone else's decision about where she would live. She told Gideon at the gate with complete directness that she did not intend to do what anyone said if she didn't agree with it. that she had been told 3 previous places were permanent and they weren't, and that she was not going to pretend things were fine when they weren't. "All right," Gideon said. Pearl looked at him, apparently having prepared for more resistance. "All right?" "All right," he said. "Don't do anything you don't agree with. Tell me when things aren't fine. Don't pretend." He opened the gate. "That seems fair." Pearl walked through the gate with her canvas bag and her fury, and Maeve was on the porch, and Pearl stopped and looked at her. "I heard about you," Pearl said, "from the county worker. She said you found the ledgers and testified." "Yes," Maeve said. "I was in the ledgers," Pearl said. "I was placed when I was 8. Maeve looked at her for a long moment. "I know," she said. "Your name was in the 3rd notebook." Pearl stared at her. "You remembered my name." "I remembered all of them," Maeve said. "Every one I read." She came down the porch steps. "I'm glad you're here, Pearl." Pearl's fury, which was real and warranted and not going anywhere anytime soon, shifted slightly on its foundation. Not collapsed, not resolved, just acknowledged, received, which was different. She went inside. Thomas explained the oatmeal situation to her within the first 10 minutes, and Lottie showed her the kittens, now grown enough to hold, and Wren showed her the chicken coop without saying a word, just walking and gesturing, and Pearl followed and watched with the watchful, assessing attention of someone deciding whether to believe in a place. She didn't decide that day, or the next. It took Pearl 4 months to decide, which was exactly as long as it took, and nobody pushed it faster than that because Silver Hollow had learned by then that you couldn't push the clock on that particular decision. You just made the place real enough that eventually the person in it stopped bracing for it to be taken away. The 4th and 5th children came the following spring. Siblings, a boy of 7 named Cal and his 4-year-old sister Iris, who had been found together and refused to be separated, which Hargrove's office had respected. Cal came in holding Iris's hand with the fierceness of someone who has decided this is his one non-negotiable. Iris came in holding Cal's hand and looking at everything with the wide, still attention of a very young child who has learned that new places require assessment before engagement. Lottie, who was 7 now and had developed considerable expertise in the matter of new arrivals, crouched down to Iris's level with the practiced ease of someone who has done this before. "Hi," she said. "Do you want to see the kittens first or the chickens first?" Iris looked at her. Then she held up 2 fingers. "Kittens, then chickens," Lottie confirmed. "Good choice. Come on." She took Iris's hand and walked to the barn. Iris went without looking back, which made Cal exhale for what might have been the first time in hours. "She'll be okay," he said to Maeve, not asking for reassurance, asking for information. "She'll be fine," Maeve said. "Lottie knows what she's doing." Cal nodded. He looked at the ranch. "Is there work?" he said. "I want to do work. I don't want to just be here." "There's plenty of work," Maeve said. "We'll find you some tomorrow." He nodded again, and some of the tight readiness in his body settled by a degree. Gideon came out of the barn and stopped when he saw Cal and did the thing he did with each new arrival. Crouched to eye level, said his name, said the ranch's name, said nobody here is going to hurt you. He'd said it so many times now it had become a kind of practice, a ritual of welcome that was also a statement of the place's values delivered in the plainest possible language. Sal listened to it with his arms crossed. "How do I know?" Cal said. The same question Thomas had asked, different voice, same calculation behind it. "You don't yet," Gideon said. Same answer. "You'll know after a while." The Blackthorn investigation formally closed in the late summer of that second year, though closed was not quite the right word. Some legal threads would trail on for years. Some of the named buyers had died before facing charges, and 3 children from the ledgers were never definitively located, which was the part that lived in Maeve's unresolved column permanently, and which she visited the way you visit a wound to check if it's healed yet and find that it hasn't. 26 children in total had been recovered and placed in new situations. 11 of them were placed with families. 7 were in county arrangements that were being monitored. 5 had aged out of the system during the investigation and were making their own way as young adults, and Hargrove's office had connected them with resources where they existed and written letters where they didn't. 3, the 3 in the unresolved column, had no confirmed status. Silver Hollow had 5. Maeve kept the accounting because she had started it, and because accuracy mattered, and because the alternative was letting the numbers blur into abstraction, and she had seen what happened when vulnerable people became abstractions. She kept it as a discipline and also as a form of witness, a record that said these were specific children with specific names and specific ages, and their situations were specific and real and continued to be so, whether or not anyone with authority was currently paying attention. She showed Hargrove the notebook when he came out to Silver Hollow in August, the last official visit in his role on the investigation. He read through it without hurrying. "The 3 in the unresolved column," he said. "If anything surfaces," she said, "anything at all, I want to know." "You'll know," he said. He handed the notebook back. "This is thorough, Miss Rourke." "Mrs. Vance," she said. "Not sharp, just accurate." He smiled briefly. "Mrs. Vance." He looked at the ranch yard where Thomas and Cal were working on the south fence under Doss's instruction, and Pearl was reading on the porch steps with the focused scowl she brought to everything she was interested in. "You've built something here. We're building it," she said. "It's not done." "No," he agreed. "I don't suppose it will be." He left before supper. Gideon saw him to the road and came back and found Maeve in the yard, and she was looking at the cottonwood by the dry creek bed, the way she sometimes did, not often, just occasionally, the way you look at a place where something pivotal happened when you need to remember what the pivot was for. "Done?" Gideon said. "Done enough," she said. "For now." He stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking about a version of this morning that didn't happen," she said. "The version where you rode past the creek bed and didn't stop." She said it without drama, just laying it out plainly the way she always did. "The version where Lottie didn't see the shape under the tree or didn't say anything, or you told her it was nothing and kept riding." "I didn't," he said. "No," she said. "You didn't." She looked at the tree. "I used to think my life was something that happened to me. Things arrived, circumstances, decisions made by other people, doors that opened or closed without my permission. I was just inside it, managing." She paused. "I don't think that anymore." "What do you think now?" She turned and looked at the house, the porch where Pearl was reading, the window where they could see Lottie's shadow moving through the kitchen, the barn where the sounds of work and instruction drifted out on the warm August air. "I think the moment Lottie took my hands, I started making choices," she said. "I think that was the first real choice I made in years, to let a child hold my hands instead of pulling away. And then it was a long series of choices after that, most of them frightening, some of them wrong, all of them mine." She paused. "I'm not saying the bad things that happened to me were my fault, they weren't, but the life I have now, that's mine. I chose it every step." He looked at her. "You did," he said. "We did," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned slightly into it, not dramatically, just a natural lean, the adjustment of someone who has gotten used to being beside a person and finds the position easy. They stood like that for a while, looking at Silver Hollow in the late afternoon light, the imperfect fence, the barn that needed its south paint touched up again, the vegetable garden that Wren had taken as her particular project and which was producing more squash than any household could reasonably consume, the porch where Pearl was reading with her scowl of engaged interest, the window where Lottie was doing something in the kitchen that involved considerable movement. Inside, Iris would be napping. Cal would be at the table with his own reading lesson, slower going than Thomas's, but proceeding with the same determined stubbornness the boy brought to everything. It was not a quiet life. It had never been a quiet life, and Maeve had stopped expecting it to be. But it was hers. Completely, irrevocably chosen hers. There is something that people don't tell you about surviving terrible things. They tell you about resilience, about coming through, about strength discovered in extremity. They leave out the part that comes after, the long, unglamorous work of building something from what's left. The way that work is full of frustration and setback and days where the progress is invisible, and the way it is also on ordinary Tuesdays and unremarkable Saturday mornings, something that fills you with a kind of gratitude so plain and undramatic that it's easy to miss. Maeve Rourke had been put in a sack and left to die because she knew something someone powerful wanted kept buried. She had survived, she had testified, she had kept the accounting, she had refused, at every stage, in every circumstance, under every pressure, to let the thing that had been done to her define the limits of what she was capable of doing. Not because she was extraordinary, because she was stubborn and practical, and because a 5-year-old had taken her hands in a dry creek bed and said she belonged somewhere, and because that declaration, made with no evidence, no information, and the complete unguarded certainty of a child who hadn't yet learned to protect herself from caring about things, had planted something that grew despite everything that came after. Lottie was 7 now. She was not a simple child, and she was not going to become a simple person. She noticed everything and remembered most of it and asked questions that sometimes had no comfortable answers, and she had taken to the work of Silver Hollow, the practical daily work of making a place that 5 other children could call real. With the same total investment she'd given everything since the morning she'd sat in the saddle and pointed at a shape under a tree and changed the direction of several lives at once. She didn't know she'd done that. Not exactly. Someday, Maeve would tell her when the telling would land in the right way. Not as a burden or a mythology, just as information. You saw something and you said something, and because of that, people who needed a home have one. That was the whole story in the plainest possible terms. The rest was just details. On the bench beneath the cottonwood, a simple wooden thing Gideon had built from fence post timber on an afternoon when he'd wanted to build something. Maeve sometimes sat in the early evening while the light went long across the pastures and the sounds of Silver Hollow organized themselves into the particular music of a full house. Boots on the porch boards. Thomas explaining something to Cal in the patient, slightly authoritative way he'd developed as the eldest, using the same tone Doss used with him. Pearl arguing a point with Lottie, both of them enjoying it in the way that people who are well-matched intellectually enjoy a good argument. Wren's quieter presence somewhere in the yard, doing her work the way she did everything, steadily, thoroughly, without needing to announce it. Gideon would be somewhere nearby. He usually was. The cottonwood had been dying slowly for years before Maeve arrived, and it was still dying slowly now. That was the nature of cottonwoods in a dry creek bed, the long, patient process of a tree that had outlasted most of what grew around it and was in no hurry to finish. It would probably be there long after all of them. The bark was still ash-colored, still leaning, still indifferent to everything that had happened beside its roots. Maeve found she didn't mind sitting near it. What had been done to her had been done. She had not erased it by surviving, and she had not resolved it by testifying, and she had not closed it by building something good in its aftermath. The wrong of it remained the wrong of it, permanent and real and not subject to revision by any amount of subsequent happiness. But she had decided, somewhere in the long months of building Silver Hollow into what it was becoming, that the permanence of the wrong didn't determine the shape of what came after. That was its own choice, made daily, often without thinking about it. Just the accumulated small decisions of someone who has elected to be here in this specific life with these specific people, doing this specific work. She had been discarded as though her life had no value. Now, on an ordinary evening in late summer, she could sit under a dying cottonwood and hear 5 children who had been discarded in various ways argue about fence posts and chickens and whose turn it was to set the table. And she could hear in that argument the specific sound of people who trust the place they're in enough to be irritated by ordinary things. That was what safety sounded like. Not silence, not peace, not the absence of conflict. Just the sound of people irritated by ordinary things because they no longer had to save their energy for the extraordinary ones. Once, Maeve had been certain her story was ending in a dry creek bed in Wyoming, alone, tied shut. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong in the best possible way. Not because she'd been rescued, not because someone had saved her, but because a child had looked at her and seen something worth keeping. And because she herself had, from that moment forward, refused to disagree. The evening light moved across the pasture. The sounds from the house settled into the ordinary rhythm of supper being prepared. Someone called her name from the porch. Lottie, who needed her for something. Probably something that had seemed urgent for approximately the past 2 minutes and would be resolved in another 5. Maeve sat on the bench a moment longer. Then she stood up and went home.